So welcome. My name is Christine Govey with Dialogue and Design Associates. We do facilitation, collaboration, and design, and based in Central Virginia. Delighted to be here. Some of you who are joining today are in this photograph. This photograph is from our most recent Middle and Upper James Riparian Consortium meeting. So it's real time, face coverings and all. So here we are. So again, welcome. We're going to be actively using the chat roll today. So I invite you to continue putting your name and affiliation into the chat roll as we do a couple of introductory things. Amber, do you want to just say a quick welcome to everybody, and then I'll jump into some logistics in just a moment.
Yep, so welcome. I know hopefully most of you on the phone today, but I'm Amber with James River Association, and I serve as sort of the convener of sorts for the effort. And welcome to our second annual Buffer Summit, virtually, of course, this year. Feel free to participate in any way you can. I've already heard some people saying they need to multitask today. So make today your own, however that looks. Really, the summit is all about, we have lots of meetings throughout the year, but this is the time of year to really share information, learn, brainstorm needs and potential solutions to getting more buffers on the ground across the James watershed. And my hope for all of us today is to keep our minds open to new approaches and ideas, and be okay with asking questions. Everybody knows different pieces of things, and so no question is a stupid question. There's a great group of knowledgeable people here, so chime in, and also feel free to share your knowledge or your experiences on stuff. And then lastly, a big thank you to Christine and Emily for pulling all of this together. They serve as the convener for the consortium, and they're going to be keeping us straight today. So thank you, Christine and Emily. And I'll pass it over to you for kind of an agenda overview and getting us going.
That sounds great. Thanks so much,
Yep.
Amber. Emily, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. This is Emily Carlson with Dialogue and Design. It's good to meet you.
Yeah. This is Christine Govey. So welcome, everybody. We're so delighted that all of you have joined us today. Many of you have participated in 5,555 Zoom meetings over the course of 2020, but some of you may not have. So a couple things about Zoom, just as we all get oriented to our space today. If you have any technical problems, the chat roll is the place to let us know you're having a technical problem. Emily, would you mind putting your cell phone, if you haven't yet, in the chat roll as well, in case anyone, hopefully not everyone, in case anyone is having technical problems or IT issues, you can text ideally Emily, because she's wearing multiple hats today. So feel free to get in touch with Emily for troubleshooting. At the same time, if you're just joining, we invite you to put your name and affiliation in the chat roll. So that's another great place just to see where folks are joining from today. We'll have time after our first speaker for networking sessions in small groups, in breakout rooms for a deeper dive and conversation and what a lot of us miss from in-person gatherings. So Zoom actually is a pretty good platform to still have a chance to engage. As you're joining the Zoom meeting today, we invite you to mute yourself if you haven't muted yourself yet. There is a chance, as I mentioned earlier, we may mute you if you happen to have some background noise going on, but you can always unmute yourself. Feel free to use the chat roll liberally. So if you have an idea, a resource, a question, a link, or a program, the chat roll is the best place to share it so that others can see it. We will be sharing a summary of the Buffer Summit, and we'll include all those resources that are shared today. At the same time, if you do not want to have your contact information shared with others, please let us know. You can reply to the welcome packet email that Emily sent out yesterday and say, hey, I actually don't want my contact info shared. It will only be shared with Buffer Summit registrants. So just let us know if you don't want your contact info shared with other registrants. Otherwise, we'll be putting a registration packet together. So again, type in your name if you can. Joining by Zoom, if you hover over your image with your cursor, you should see 3 little blue dots on the right-hand side. And if you click on those 3 little blue dots, there's a place to rename yourself. Also under participants, if you click on participants and see your name, you can rename yourself there as well. We do recommend connecting with video and screen sharing, or sharing your video if you're able, but at the same time, if your connection's spotty, if you turn off your video, it'll free up bandwidth. I really love seeing your faces though, so if you're in a place where you can leave your video on, it's really great to be able to connect with people, especially for those breakout sessions, especially, so I want to encourage you to leave those on. Again, if you're not speaking, we encourage you to stay muted. And please do note that the session's being recorded to be shared. So if there's any concern that you have, then feel free to go ahead and turn off your video for any reason, because it's being recorded. There is a function as well on Zoom where you can raise your hand. Emily and I will be keeping an eye on that. So if you have a question, you're welcome to raise your hand, but also we'll have discussion points after each of the presentations and different ways for you to engage. So you can share your questions in the chat roll. We'll also be welcoming questions just for you to share over, your audio or video as well. So just know that that's going to be a possibility. Step away as you need to. Take care of your own needs today. And we encourage you to connect with others. As Amber mentioned, one of the primary goals of the Buffer Summit is to actually make connections. So if you say, oh, there's Nissa, I've been meaning to connect with Nissa for 3 months and I haven't had a chance to, then send her a message or find a way to connect. So that's one of our prime goals of the Buffer Summit as well, is to actually connect. Few additional things on Zoom. There is a toolbar where you can mute and unmute yourself. That is a microphone icon. There is a video camera. You can start and stop your video. That same toolbar has the chat roll on the right-hand side. You can click on that. One thing that's helpful, some folks don't know, is when the screen is being shared, we'll stop sharing our screen at various points today. But when it is being shared, in the place where people's images show up, there are a couple little icons on the top of that box. One's a little rectangle, a thin rectangle. Another one's a fat rectangle. Then there's 2 rectangles on top of each other, and then there's a grid. If you click on the grid, you can see more people at once. You can also grab the corner of your Zoom windows and move them around, just like you would any internet browser window. So just grab the corner, you can resize your screen. If you hit escape, it'll take you out of the full screen view. We know your time is precious, and we're really thankful that you've chosen to spend your time with us today for the Buffer Summit. So thank you. We're really incredibly grateful, especially to our panelists and presenters today. So thank you in advance, panelists and presenters. Amber is going to be introducing each of the panelists as we go through the summit today, so you'll get to know who folks are. And Emily put together a really awesome program. So if you're curious who folks are, you can go to one of the middle pages of the program and read their bios, and they've graciously shared their email addresses as well. So if you said, that's interesting, Matt had that really cool idea, I want to follow up with him, his email address is in that welcome packet. You'll also find direct links to some of the tools that Amber is going to be sharing in a few moments as well. So again, if you're just joining, we invite you to put your name and affiliation in the chat roll. And our agenda today. So in just a few minutes, Amber is going to be giving an overview of the consortium itself. For some of you, you may have attended every meeting of the consortium since its inception, and maybe you attended the Buffer Summit, which we had in person last year. For others, this might be your first chance to learn about the consortium. So Amber is going to be sharing a little bit more about it. And then James Martin of the Department of Environmental Quality is going to be talking about the state of buffers in the James watershed, and an update on watershed health. I want you to think of each of our presenters today as hitting the tip of the iceberg. Because we're on an online space and there are a lot of demands on all of our time, we're keeping the Buffer Summit as short and sweet and high potency if possible. So if you want to learn more, then let us know, but also let your presenters know. So you're going to have probably a lot more information that you want to hear, but again, you have their email addresses. So James is starting out with a quick update on the state of the James watershed health. Then we have a networking session. We're going to break into breakout groups. Then we have a panel focusing on buffers in the teenage years and stewarding your buffer into adulthood, which is very exciting in those teenage years across the board always. Then we'll have a break. We'll leave the Zoom room open. You're welcome just to informally chat during the Zoom breaks. Then we'll come back at 11:10. We'll be staying on time today with a second panel on why conservation makes sense, stories from the field. A little bit before noon, 11:55 exactly, we have Devin Floyd from the Center for Urban Habitats with a talk on natural plant communities of our region. Then we have a half-hour break for lunch. You are welcome to bring your lunch and hang out on Zoom and just chat with other folks. It's an unstructured time, but again, we'll leave the Zoom room open for you to just visit and hang out with people. We have Jim Eccles of the Department of Conservation and Recreation talking about riparian restoration through the soil and water conservation districts. And then we have a panel really excited about the reimagining the conservation workforce, restoring communities and water quality. A few minutes after 1, and then we'll have our closing with evaluation. We'll share ways that you can stay connected with our website, which is jamesriverconsortium.org, and we'll wrap up at 2 o'clock today. So that's where we're headed over the course of the day. Of course, if you need to jump off and jump back on, that's fine. We do invite you to try to put aside your to-do list for the next 4 or 5 hours, if you're able to join us, and sit back and relax and enjoy learning about buffers in the Middle and Upper James Riparian Watershed. We don't, you know, that's one of the things we do actually miss being in person, is just being able to focus on one thing. So if your to-do list allows it, I invite you to close your email window. I invite you to put your text messages aside. I invite you to not worry about the presentation you're giving in a couple hours, and just have a chance to listen and learn from folks, and consider it a mini staycation into buffer summits in Central Virginia. So really, again, appreciate everyone joining us today. Lastly, just a few additional things. If you see me doing this, that means we got to wrap it up. That means we got to keep going. We want to thank our presenters for staying on time today and noting their times. We're going to be really very strictly staying on time. And so just thanks in advance for that, everybody. And then the flash networking sessions, which will be starting at 9:40, are going to be a chance for a deep dive. With all that being said, before Amber gives an overview, are there any questions from anybody? Any technical problems that you're having that you just need to give a shout out? Any thoughts from anyone before I turn it over to Amber? All right, well, again, we're so delighted that all of you have joined us. Please do continue to put your name and affiliations in the chat roll if you're just joining. And Amber, I will turn it over to you.
All right, thanks, Christine. I loved your mini staycation. I've been treating it that way. Put on your comfy socks and hang out. All right, so yeah, you can go ahead and go to the next slide.
And there will be a few second delay just so all presenters know when you say next,
Okay.
and when you actually see the slide advance.
Great. So many of you have heard this before, but so the Riparian Consortium is convened by the James River Association. I'm the Senior Watershed Restoration Manager there. And the area that we fully cover as an organization is that area in green, which is the whole James River watershed. And our main mission is to protect the James and connect people to the James. And we do that through awareness, appreciation, action, and advocacy. Go on to the next one. But for the purpose of this group, we're really focused on kind of the freshwater portion of the James. And so the Middle and Upper James is where we are focused, which is really the majority. You can see in that locator map, the Middle and Upper covers a lot of the James. And so that's our geography. And then our practice I cannot talk this morning. Our practice focus is riparian buffer practices down to the left. Go to the next one. So this effort started, I mean, really these things start beforehand with, you know, creating partnerships with different folks, but it really kicked off in 2019 thanks to a grant from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. And you'll see in orange at the top where we kind of are in the process of figuring out, you know, what we are and where we're going. And so where we've been is kind of gathering all of those partners together, figuring out what our structure is, what is our vision, building expertise and team strategies. And now we're sort of testing those out in different areas. And then as we head into the end of this year and into next year, sort of stepping back and seeing how things are going, refining that strategy and setting goals for taking this beyond that 3-year grant from NIFWF. You can go to the next one. Just a snapshot of some of the partners. This is not all of them. This just highlights some of those that serve on the steering committee or lead different action teams. And I've already noted Dialogue and Design is serving as the convener of the effort, or the facilitator. Go to the next one. So our vision for the group, we just nailed this down earlier this year. So this is new from the summit last year. Our vision is growing partnerships to create healthy streamside ecosystems for clean water in the James River today and tomorrow. So you'll notice we didn't just say forest buffers, because we are really trying to take a holistic approach to these riparian areas. And we realize the benefit of trying to layer these 5 things when we can, and making sure that we're including partners from those 5 focus areas when we can. Go to the next one. And so we have 4 teams right now. We have the outreach and targeting team. And let me back up a minute. The purpose of the teams really, so we have these larger consortium meetings, and then things come out of those that somebody needs to think about or work on or take to the next step. And so that's really what the teams are for. And we've got different partners leading those, and anyone is welcome to join any of these teams and attend as you're able to. So the first one is outreach and targeting. And the lead there is the Center for Watershed Protection for the targeting aspect. And just a note, we are in need of an outreach lead. Kelly Eidings used to be with us, and she is off to get her PhD now. So anyhow, the goal of that team is really finding ways to make sure we have the right message for the right landowner and by the right partner in areas that are really going to make the biggest difference. And then the implementation team is led by myself and Sammy with Trout Unlimited. And the goal there is really just coordinating our implementation efforts. And one example of something we're working on is the James River Buffer Program, which is kind of an alternative program to the state and federal ones that can kind of fill gaps. Go to the next one. Our research team is led by JRA and Stroud Water Research Center. And the goal there is making sure that everybody is sort of knowing what the best methods currently are for our region and for the right method for the right site. So they're going to be developing sort of a best practices document. I don't know what that's going to look like yet. We're working on it. And they've got some test plots, as you can see in that photo, trying out different ways to control weeds around those seedlings that are non-herbicide approaches. And then Knowledge Network is led by the Alliance for the Chesapeake Bay, and they are working with the Chesapeake Bay Landscape Professional Program to develop some riparian buffer trainings, both for the rural and agricultural setting, but also for the urban setting. And we're hoping that those will be, I'm not going to give any dates, but in the next year, those will be live, let's say. All right, go to the next one. And we're super excited about 2 tools that we launched. One, the coordination tool was launched, I don't know, a couple months ago. And then the Streamside program report was just live. I think it actually went live last night. So this one's brand new. But the purpose of each of the coordination tool was in response to people kind of wanting to know who is working in their neck of the woods, and a central place to catalog all of that. So it's a free tool. Anybody, there's no password. The first screen breaks down our WIP3 progress for riparian buffers, and you can view it by different types of practice. And the different shades are how far along we are in different counties, or by HUC 10 or by HUC 12. It also has partner work areas that you can click on. The one highlighted in green there is, for example, the Ravenna Conservation Alliance. So if you're looking to partner with someone or something, you can easily go in here and it'll end up telling you the contact information for them, as well as a priorities tab to see and layer all of the different types of priority tools that people use for riparian restoration work. And then the one that we launched today was in response to a lot of our partners saying it's really hard to know what programs are out there to help people restore their riparian buffers. And they change constantly, and you never know if somebody else has something going on somewhere. And if it's hard for us, then it's definitely hard for landowners to know. So the goal of this is not to solve all their problems, but at least you can go in, enter where the address is, some simple things about your property, and it will narrow those options down and print a simple report for you with the names of the programs that are potentially good for you and who to contact, all the way down to like if it's going to recommend vax, for example, it'll give you the contact for your local district because it knows your address. So our real hope there is to get these people to someone that can help them and take them the next step. And both of those can be found at jamesriverconsortium.org to make it simple. On the home page, you'll see the orange button up there at the top of the screen. That's what they'll look like. Coordination tool, and then explore our programs. Either one of those will take you to one of these tools. All right, next. All right, I was right in time, Christina. I was trying to stay on my time.
Great work, Amber. Great modeling.
I know.
Awesome. Good job. Good job. This is
Stressful
perfect.
looking at the clock and looking at the screen. Like.
So great. So we just have a minute for questions. Any questions from folks in the chat room? I don't see any questions yet, but does anyone want to unmute yourselves and ask any questions about the tool or the consortium?
I know 1 minute's hard to feel like you have time.
It is. It is.
But I'm always
We do
available by email me or call me if you have questions about any of these things. I'm happy to talk to you.
And our next full meeting, we'll mention this at the end of the consortium, will be November 12th. And there's a lot more time for looking at tools there. We're really excited about these tools, so please do check them out. Give us feedback. If you have feedback about the tools, they're obviously, at least one of them brand new, so very exciting. And thanks, Amber, for that overview. So we're going to keep...
I should have given a shout out. Let me pay respect to Chesapeake Conservancy developed both of those tools for us. Just one shout out, that's it.
Perfect, thank you. And
yep.
Shireen is doing already putting some great resources in the chat roll. So Shireen, that's awesome, thank you. All right, so with that, thanks Amber for that helpful overview and context. We're gonna set the stage now to the watershed itself and what the state of the watershed health is. And then we're gonna go into breakout sessions for you to have a chance to talk a little bit more about your own work very informally with other people. And we just have 1 or 2 questions for your conversation. So Amber, I'll turn it over to you to introduce James.
Great. Yeah, we can go to the next slide, I think is the intro. Yep. So first on our plate today is hearing from James Martin with the Virginia Department of Environmental Quality. He is the Chesapeake Bay coordinator and many other things. But he manages the Chesapeake Bay Watershed Implementation Plan, including the tracking and reporting of those implementation activities. And we are excited that he took time. I know he's got a busy day, so I'm going to pass it over to him to get us knowing where we are on buffers in the James.
Great, thanks. Good morning, everyone. Nice to see those of you's faces who are on video, and missing all of you that aren't. Let's go ahead to my first slide, please. I wanted to share with you some information this morning about progress on the James, and really a lot of the materials I have for you I tried to focus on the James River and where possible the upper James, upper and middle James portions. Looks like I don't see the presentation. Is anybody else?
This takes me back. I don't know how many of y'all went last year, but I don't know if you remember when the computer died on Bobby Whitescarver, and I was trying to find a charger. Thanks, Rex, I think it was, that saved me that day.
You know, while we wait for the presentation to come up, I'll share with you a little reflection on successes from previous meetings of this group and previous summits. You know, one of the topics I remember talking about at the last summit was those Virginia Department of Correction farms and what a great opportunity they were for implementation of conservation actions. And so that kind of, at least for me, it was the first time a lot of those topics were being discussed and opportunities were being considered. And lo and behold, this year's NIFWIF funding recently announced included some funding for implementation on those James River Department of Corrections farms. So really excited about that opportunity. And again, it's groups like this coming together, putting together ideas and plans that really make that work. Here we go. That's me. We're going to talk about progress. This first slide, go ahead to the next one, is really progress in the James River in terms of load reductions that we've achieved over time, but also demonstrating that for the phase 3 WIP out to 2025, we definitely have more work to go in the James. You'll notice that the majority of the remaining reductions are happening in that orange section of the stacked bar. That's the agricultural sector. If you look at the difference in that orange bar and compare it to the difference between 2019 and 2025, overall, it's not that much different. Across Virginia's Bay watershed, about 75% of our remaining reductions are targeted in the agricultural sector. There is action and work happening in all sectors, but ag is our largest remaining opportunity, if you will, to seek additional reductions. So making good progress on nitrogen and phosphorus loads, but this is loads delivered to the bay, and I hope next time I come back and present to you, I'll have some additional tools that will let us take a harder look at local water quality and how things are changing there based on our actions over time. So let's put a pin in that, and when I see you next year, hopefully I'll have some additional materials to help inform our decisions moving forward based on monitoring results in local streams. Next slide, please. Specifically thinking about forest buffers here, what I've shown in the little table is the forest buffer implementation levels that are reported each year. DEQ gathers up the BMP information from all of our implementation partners, and we report that up to the Bay program. It gets run through our models, and that's how we produce those loads charts that I just showed you. So we're in the midst of our 2020 implementation data collection. So if you have implementation actions over the course of this past year, definitely try to make sure they're being reported up to the DEQ into our BMP warehouse by someone, whether it's each individual agency or organization, or if we're aggregating and have one person reporting. Either approach is fine, but we definitely want to make sure we're capturing all that reporting. When you look at forest buffers and the trend in progress and where we need to go, it's clear that something's not going right, right? In 2018, we had 1,700 acres that we got credit for in the Bay models. In 2019, we were down to 1,300 acres of forest buffers, and the WIP calls for almost 28,000 acres. So it's a significant workload, but something else is going on, and that something else is BMP verification. In our models, forest buffers have a 10-year credit duration. So as of 2019, any practices that were implemented in 2009 or before, and if you think back, 2009 was kind of the heart of the first set of CREP contracts, which is why we're seeing such large numbers of BMPs dropping out now. As buffers pass that 10-year credit duration in the model, they are removed from the reporting record unless we have a visual verification that those buffers are still in place and still functioning. And so that goes beyond just looking at it on imagery. You have to ensure not just that the trees are still there, but that the buffer is in fact still functioning as a buffer, meaning there's not concentrated flow through the buffer, things of that sort. So it does take an on-site inspection at this point, although we are looking at opportunities to try and consider and use LiDAR and flow path data to try and help us draw conclusions about the effectiveness of buffers and re-verifying them. But it's an important piece, right? Across Virginia, we've lost 11,000 acres of buffer implementation. About half of that is probably in the upper and middle James, as is the upper and middle James, about half of our overall WIP 3 BMP goals for forest buffers. So a lot more implementation has happened. So I don't want you to be discouraged, but we do have a lot of work to do over the course of the next 5 years. Next slide, please. And I think it's groups like this that are going to help us get there. One of the things I really like about this group is that you do think about the broad range of co-benefits that you get from buffers, and you try to bring parties together from all of those groups, people that might be interested in the wildlife aspects or the biodiversity or the fish habitat, trout habitat. Carbon sequestration is a great one. Obviously, trees are huge in that regard. So I guess the message here is we know there's a lot of co-benefits from buffers. It's why we call for so many of them in our implementation plan. This is just a small list. Please, if you have others that you think are noteworthy, add them into the chat. Let's build coalition around these co-benefits, bring people together to accelerate our implementation. And I'll also say that I think these co-benefits are an opportunity from a marketing perspective, if you will. How do we convince property owners that forest buffers are a good thing? Some of them, may not be concerned about Chesapeake Bay water quality. Some may care more about other issues, other co-benefits that forest buffers and other healthy riparian corridors can provide. So let's continue to build off of these co-benefits. Thank you. The last slide I have for you today is really, I just wanted to provide you with some links. I hope that the presentation materials will be shared so that you can actually click on these links. We've got our WIP and our 2-year milestones. Those are available on DEQ's websites. Chesapeake Progress is a website that the Bay program hosts that keeps you up to date on our progress toward meeting the Bay TMDL, as well as all of the other outcomes in the Chesapeake Bay Watershed Agreement from 2014. CAST is our watershed model. It'll allow you to implement or design an implementation scenario, run it through CAST to find out what the load reduction effect of that set of BMPs would be. It's also where you can find information on our annual progress reporting and those results. Chesapeake Bay Data Dashboard is a new tool I'd encourage you to take a look at. It has a lot of the same data layers that you saw in the tools presented earlier, but in addition, it also has water water quality monitoring data and trends that that you can visualize on that tool. It's really really useful. And the last one is our Chesapeake Bay resources and tools tab. All of these tools are linked there, as are others. So definitely take advantage of them as you can. Finally, my contact information, if you have questions, particularly now about reporting your implementation efforts to DEQ, please reach out to me. I'm happy to help you through that process and make sure we're capturing all the hard work and good things that, that this group is doing. So with that, I will wrap up. Thank you so much.
Great. Thanks so much, James. Really appreciate that. So a couple people have put ideas into the chat roll, which is really helpful, about co-benefits, edible species in the buffer, spaces for people to enjoy. James, Roy has asked a question about when you note the 11,000 acres of loss due to verification, is that automatic expiration versus automatic actual verification in the buffer being no longer present?
Yeah, the way verification currently works, the old days of the model, every BMP lasted forever. So nothing ever fell out. And as the Bay Program Partnership received some criticism and scientific reviews that suggested that was not the best approach, my personal view is that they may have swung too far the other direction. But what we have now is after 10 years, it goes from you get credit for everything to you get credit for nothing. If it's older than 10 years and has not been inspected, you get zero credit. We get zero credit. So I hope that answers your question, Roy. If not, feel free to follow up.
Yeah, great. Thanks, James, and good question, Roy. So we will make all the slides available to attendees after the fact, so you'll get all the links. If you would like for us to put those links in the chat roll as well, we can, but just let us know in the chat roll. Any other questions for James from anyone? All right, well, we have one of these great tools on Zoom is the reactions button. You can find that in the bottom of your toolbar and give a thumbs up or clap, or you can give snaps or thank you to James. So let's thank James for joining for an overview of the James Watershed Health. James, that was awesome.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, I can't stay with you all day. I have another Bay Program meeting that I have to go to, talking about climate change with the management board at the Bay Program. So exciting stuff. It
is exciting stuff. Appreciate that you joined us. Thanks, James.
Thank you.
So this is the part of the meeting that a lot of people have said they're really excited about. As we're not having the chance to gather in person, we are going to have a chance for a little bit of interaction coming up next. And we're going to be breaking into breakout rooms. And in Zoom, the way breakout rooms happen is in just a few moments, I'm going to break you up into automatically assigned breakout rooms, meaning that Zoom will just automatically pop you into a breakout room with other people. You will leave this main room. You'll have to click on a button that says yes to join, and you'll go into a space that will look just like this one, but with a smaller number of people. You'll have about 25 minutes or so in those small group rooms, and then you'll see a message saying the rooms will be closing in about 60 seconds. Then I'll close the room and you'll have to click a button to come back to this space. When we come back to this space, we're going to come back for our panel at 10:15 about buffers for the teenage years, stewarding your buffer into adulthood. So we're really excited about that panel, as well as for the chance for you to introduce yourselves to each other. In your small groups, what we're going to ask for you to do is to share your name and affiliation, and what is one threat to Streamside ecosystems in your area, and what is one solution or program that's been helpful to address it. So what's one threat that you've seen that could be personally, could be professionally, it could be in a colleague or a neighbor's backyard or watershed. So what's one threat again to Streamside ecosystems, and what's one solution or program that has helped address that threat? Bring your top ideas back to share in the chat roll when you come back so that we can hear what some of those top threats have been and what some of the top programs and solutions have been. The information that you share is directly helpful for the consortium in planning our next steps. So it's not just a conversation to have a conversation. That in and of itself is helpful, but the information that you're sharing is also helpful to the consortium to help guide the future direction. So any questions about what we're doing in the breakout rooms before I open them up? All right, let's see here. So it looks like, Emily, you may need to open the breakout rooms up, it looks like. So with that, you should see a place that says, I'm going to stop sharing for a second. Here we go, I have it. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and create them now. Any questions from anybody before we go into breakout rooms? You will have about 25 minutes in the breakout rooms. And again, what's one threat to Streamside health? And what's one thing, one solution or program that's been helpful? So make sure everybody has a chance to share ideas in your breakout room. Make sure you keep the conversation going. Take a couple notes, bring back your top ideas, and we'll see you back in about 25 minutes. Don't forget to introduce yourself. So enjoy, everybody. We'll see you back in about 25 minutes. For a moment.
And needing to understand more about that, and that it's not always the best solution. And what else? We had a talk more around awareness of kind of getting people away from the aesthetic of mowing down to the edge of the creek in urban areas. And we had a decent length of a conversation talking about property tax breaks for people who do put buffers on their properties in these suburban and urban environments, instead of kind of just charging them funds when they maybe clear forest, instead being more giving people props when they do something good.
Great. Thanks, Amber. Appreciate that. Yeah, so how are those breakout groups? Did you have enough time to have a conversation with folks? Thumbs up, yes. Was that enough time? Okay, great. I see a couple folks are adding some highlights into the chat roll. So I want to invite others to continue to add threats or solutions or programs that have been especially helpful in addressing those threats. So far I see Rex has said the threat is the rural subdivision and development and the resulting increase in impervious surface. Laurel has mentioned cattle in the buffer and in streams. Beth mentioned threats are development, invasive plant species, highly fragmented landscapes, and stream bank erosion. Joey said threats are farming and ag, stormwater runoff, and littering. Laurel says deer browse and invasive. Seth says landowner adoption is a threat as well. Any other ideas? What programs or solutions have been most helpful? Anything that has just been really stellar in addressing those threats, or any programs that have been particularly helpful that anyone wants to just share out loud or in the chat roll?
Our group had said in terms of threats to the landowner adoption is that these programs are putting more money toward maintenance, the maintenance side of the buffer. And, you know, we're communicating that a lot better with the landowners. You know, it's not just a project that you put in and you're done. It's going to take some work and some time for several years to get it to be successful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great. So yes, time always. Thanks, Patti. Any other feedback from folks around solutions, things that worked?
Our group was mainly urban and suburban areas, so development and the landscape behavior of people that are living at the water's edge with these buffers in their backyard. They often, we also have resource protection areas, the 100-foot regulated buffer. So part of the benefit is you have that regulatory compliance part, and in York County and James City County, a lot of these areas, they preserve the buffer through the development process. And in York County, they're preserving them as a BMP in the development process. So they're encouraging that use rather than other BMPs.
Mm-hmm.
And then things that have worked is working through these residential stewardship programs. You know, James River has one, Alliance has one, VCAP, Virginia Conservation Assistance Programs through the Soil and Water Conservation Districts. They have cost share programs, and they have technical advisors that will help people to handle things differently. So kind of a carrot and stick have worked.
Great. Great. Thanks, Shireen. That's really helpful. And I love how you spelled out that acronym for VCAP. Thanks for doing that. That was really helpful. So a couple of other ideas are coming into the chat roll right now about what's working and what are threats. So feel free to keep adding those ideas. That's really helpful as we consider the overall upper and middle James watershed. We know that the solutions and threats are different in each of the sub-watersheds. So your feedback helps us tease out where to focus. So thanks all of you. And we hope you had a chance to connect maybe with someone new as well. So we're going to dive into our first panel now. Amber is going to be introducing the panelists, and this is Buffers Beyond the Teenage Years, Stewarding Your Buffer into Adulthood. For all of our panels, we'll have a couple different tools for some panels, not for others, and we'll have time for questions and discussion at the end of each panel. So feel free to include questions for panelists in the chat roll. And again, if you have any technical problems, Emily, can you put your number back in the chat roll so it's refreshed, please? We'll be including links that people share in the chat roll. If anyone has any technical problems or troubleshooting problems, you can text, or if you need to, call Emily or let us know in the chat roll. So Amber, with that, I'll turn it over to you to introduce our panelists, and I will start sharing my screen again.
Thanks, Christine. All right, buffers beyond the teenage years. I know we all have visions of what that might mean. We all know teenagers. So we've got Patti Nylander with Department of Forestry. She's a senior area forester in the Upper James. I had too many papers. So she mostly works in the Mountain Valley work area. She's worked for DOF for 19 years and is supervisor in the counties of Allegheny, Augusta, Bath, Highland, and Rockbridge. And she's helped with the establishment of many riparian buffers on public and private lands. And her work includes developing planting plans, planting trees, cleaning up after flooding events, etc. And then we also have Lara Johnson with Department of Forestry. She is the program manager of urban and community forestry at DOF. And she is an ISA certified arborist and fire GIS specialist. And she also manages a sheep farm with her family in Central Virginia. And I know she's calling in from Alabama today, where she has been deployed. So big thanks to Lara for making time for us today. Yeah. So without further ado, and then I'll be talking a little bit, but just to introduce an urban project that I've been working on. So Patti, I'll toss it to you.
All right. If you want to start with our first slide. So yeah, so today I just kind of wanted to spend some time talking about what some of these buffers look like. You know, we spend a lot of time talking about getting them established and put on the ground, and that takes a lot of effort just in itself to get that landowner buy-in, to kind of get all the stars to align and get it to happen. But just wanted to try and go beyond that a little bit and see what elements are still needed to kind of make sure that buffer makes it. So I do have a lot of pictures, and just full disclosure, these are not in the Upper James watershed, but they are on projects on public land that I helped manage. So I have no one to blame but myself if they look bad. So, but this is a project that we put in, it was planted in 1991. So 29-year-old buffer. You can see there's still grass in there, but we're, you know, approaching or pretty much at canopy closure. Okay. Next slide.
There'll be a few second delay, just so all the panelists know.
So I just kind of wanted to go over maybe like kind of 3 elements I think that can just kind of help your teenage buffer make it. And these are the 3 that I thought would probably be the most important. Managing your invasives, they're still out there. You know, we're dealing with them before we put the trees in, we're dealing with them as we put the trees in, and even after we put the trees in. There's still a maintenance component. And I think recognizing that it may be messy, but it might actually be okay, some of the messiness. So trying to tease that out, like what's too messy and what's okay. And just kind of staying engaged, being patient and still checking in. You know, again, we can't walk away from these buffers. We can't walk away from our teenagers. They need help and guidance from us as parents and as adults. They don't necessarily want us helicopter hovering over them, but we do need to check in and help them out. Okay. So we were trying to determine, well, what are the teenage years for a buffer? And we felt that it was probably generally agreed that the establishment phase of a buffer was probably 1 to 3 years after planting. And some of the things that we're doing with those buffers at that time, we're doing survival checks, we're trying to deal with grass competition, maybe replacing some of our dead trees, maintaining tubes as they they fall over, we put them back up, and treating invasives, always in there. So teenage years, I would say maybe starting about year 4 until it's hard to say, you know, but probably at least 4 to 10, maybe 4 to 15 years, you're kind of in those like teenage years. And so what do we need to be on the lookout for in these formative years? You know, who are our trees hanging out with and what are they up to? We need to keep an eye on them. And at what point can we kind of let go? You know, they've matured, they're on their own, they're ready to go. So at what point can we do that? And just this picture right here was a buffer planted in 2008 at the Augusta Forestry Center, which is where my office is located. And we'll talk a little bit more about kind of why it looks the way it does. But those trees are about 30 feet tall. So, okay. So again, trying to identify buffers at different ages, I had a hard time finding like a definition of a mature buffer. It was hard to look up, like even just doing a Google search, it was hard to find. So I tried to kind of cobble something together. So this is maybe just my take on what a mature buffer is. I would say it requires little maintenance, probably no mowing, and is approaching or at canopy closure. So at that point, you know, you have kind of that mature forest setting, kind of like the image you see on the right, again, with that 29-year-old buffer. On the left, you can see that 13-year-old buffer. That's also at the Augusta Forestry Center. We have some shade happening, but we still have a lot of younger trees making their way up as well. So I would say probably the one on the right is much closer to maturity, and that 13-year-old one is certainly still a teenager. Okay. All right, yeah, so like I said, that first one, invasives, they just won't quit. Even after the establishment phase, managing invasives, it still has to be something that you're doing. You know, and whether that's in the form of mowing, weed eating, herbicide, or, you know, if you have to nuke it from orbit, it's the only way to be sure. And I'll give 2 points of extra credit for anyone who knows that movie reference. But yeah, so, you know, whatever methodology is going to work to try to deal with those invasives. As you can see, we were doing at Augusta, we were pulling honeysuckle, multiflora rose, and it was mainly mechanical work, just loppers, chainsaws, and gloved hands. And that was one of many trailer dumps of invasives that we got out of that site. Okay. And, you know, so you're dealing with those invasives, but that maintenance, it certainly makes a difference. And those maintenance needs change as the buffer matures. So early on in that establishment phase, you know, sometimes the stakes may kind of tip over a little bit. You go out with a hammer, you kind of knock them back in. You remove the bird net as the trees first come out. When these trees start getting older, you know, you start to get to a point of taking the shelter off. You start getting to a point where you're maybe dealing with flood material that's getting caught up in the branches or even in the upper limbs of the tree. And that's what you can see here. This was the same tree before we did some of that maintenance work and removing the debris from a flooding event, and then after. So all that stuff was just sitting up against the trunk of the tree. That can be great habitat for mice and other little critters. So we've put all this time and effort into getting this tree to grow, and only to maybe create habitat for something to eat it. So removing the debris, vines and invasives from around the trees, the vines can, you know, damage the limbs, they can choke it. So that's really important, that maintenance, but it is a little different than what we would have early on. Okay. All right, remove the tubes if the timing is right. And kind of to mow or not to mow, that is the question. You can see on the left, there's an image of a tree that the tube, that perforated seam that exists on most like 2-Bex shelters, it did come apart and broke. And so it's now time for that tube to come off of that tree. And then, so that's an important element when these trees are starting to outgrow the shelter. You really don't want it staying on there. It can damage the main trunk of the tree. And then again, kind of to mow or not to mow. And I think a lot of this also comes down to landowner objectives. You know, this is an area that was planted at Woodrow Wilson. That's kind of a park area. You can see they do still keep it mowed, but they no longer mow the buffer where it used to be. They mowed straight down to that creek bank. And so, you know, while mowing for that particular property is important because they're trying to keep a park setting and they have like a trail and those sorts of things, it is still just part of a management and a landowner objective that I think we just need to be mindful of with a lot of these projects. Okay. Next slide. Oh, okay. I did see that little chat about leaving the tubes on for deer rub. That can be important, but you still need to let air circulation into that tree or it can rot. So yes, you can leave it loose, but it can still lead to damage. But good point. Thank you for sharing. And is it okay to let some things go? A messy area may be a real benefit to wildlife. And so if we can be if we can communicate that well, and help landowners realize that maybe a little bit of mess here and there isn't so bad, you know, as long as it's not crazy scary or overrun with invasives. And I think it is important to remember that these buffer areas are oftentimes on private land and they're a reflection of that landowner. And so they can be our best advocate for these programs and these buffers. If they're happy and proud of how their buffer looks, then that's a great story they can share with their neighbor to garner more participation. If it's ugly and they're embarrassed by it, that is not a great story to share. So, you know, finding that balance of what's a little bit of mess and maybe okay, and, you know, what's going to start getting unruly and unacceptable to a landowner. Trying to navigate that can sometimes be a challenge. But I think at some point we do need to stop mowing and be okay with the appearance. And I would say that that's what these two slides represent there at the Woodrow Wilson property. You know, we're not mowing it anymore. Those trees, they're doing okay, and they're going to continue to grow above that grass. Okay. And again, just staying engaged. You know, our buffer still needs us. We need to check in every once in a while, and keeping the end goal in mind. You know, and what is that? We want trees and an area of trees and plants that filter excess nutrients, provide habitat, you know, all those different elements that we've talked about and the benefits that we gain from buffers. And even a teenage buffer can achieve these grown-up goals. This buffer in particular at Augusta, yes, it is still mowed in between, but it used to be mowed straight up to the bank. And so now we do have some trees there that are providing that filtering capacity. They're providing some wildlife. For management reasons, they still mow the area to try to prevent seed drift into the nursery beds, but it's still achieving some of those grown-up goals of providing wildlife. So we don't have canopy closure yet, but we're still meeting a lot of those many functions. Okay. And buffers will mature at their own pace, right? We can't rush them. And I think just some factors to consider. With all things being equal, some buffers are still going to fare better than others. I would say due to site productivity, the past use of that land, if it was heavily grazed or, you know, heavy in terms of crop production or even heavy development use, you know, that past use is going to have an impact on the productivity and growing capacity of that site. And natural occurrences, flood. This Augusta buffer flooded 2 consecutive years after it was planted. Frost damage, which I did see some projects this spring that were impacted by frost, insect and disease. We're seeing EAB impact some of these buffers, and other pathogens. And be patient and realistic about what the area will look like, and just kind of remember what those benefits are. So the Woodrow Wilson buffer, you kind of see an interior view of the buffer on the right, that 29-year-old buffer. I mean, it's very contrived, right? The trees are in straight rows. It's very evident that that was planted, but it's still functioning. It's got canopy closure, great wildlife benefits. It's probably not what we're going to see on the side of Little North Mountain in terms of riparian area, but it's still of great value in providing water quality benefits. On the left, you see as we extend out from that forested buffer area, we still have work to do, you know, trying to establish less grass, but that's what it used to look like. So we have made an improvement, I would say, on the landscape in terms of adding more trees. All right, and yeah, just to kind of recap, invasive species, I think are going to continue to be a management concern. We're always going to be dealing with them, and by whatever means necessary, herbicide, mowing, whatever it needs to be. Teenage buffers, they still need some TLC. They still need some tender loving care. They need us to check in with them, make sure that they're doing okay. They may seem unruly. We may not want to do it, but we do need to take the time to do it. Be patient, stay engaged, and you know, growing good buffers takes time. We can't rush them. And you know, again, the best method for getting more buffers in the landscape is to point to ones that are successful, and that landowner can share that positive experience. All right, I'll turn it over to Amber.
Yep.
Thanks so much, Patti. So as we're pulling up the next slide, there's that awkward few second delay. I want to encourage people to put your questions in the chat roll. As you have them, we'll be coming back to questions at the end. So if you have any questions for Patti, feel free to pop them in. Amber?
I kind of like the slide delay. It makes you take a minute. I appreciate it.
I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah,
That's awesome.
I think it's a good reminder.
Good.
So I'm going to just introduce you to this project, and then Lara's going to talk about how the teenage buffer there is doing in an urban environment. But I just wanted to give you some context to how the project even came about. So this is where we're going to be going. It's in a neighborhood called Belmead in Southside Richmond. You can see on the map on the right where it's at. And Albro Creek, which I will note, when I first started working on this project back in 2011, no one even knew the name of the creek that ran through this community. And we figured it out after lots of digging. But it has a name now, Albro, and it flows to Goods Creek that flows to the James. So that's where we're going. All right, next slide. And this just shows you back when we started, this is the stretch of stream that runs through really the heart of the community. And they have a real gift here that they've got their elementary school there, which actually has a theme of the James River, which is pretty cool. They have the community center and the park, and then the stream that runs right through the middle of it. But just within this short stretch, it grows through all of these different types of ways of being. So some areas have vegetated banks, some it's just straight asphalt. There was a real bad eroding bank that you can see there in that third picture. And then it goes into that, kind of a, not a culvert, an open sort of culvert. Go to the next one. So for some of these projects, really engaging the community, particularly when it's at the heart of the community, is really important. And so this was a plan that was developed back in 2012. You can look more into this. There's some links that you can put in the chat for them. But basically we developed, Skio and Green Infrastructure Center developed a walkable watershed plan, basically looking at how can we connect the community members to their streams in their neighborhood, and how can we improve water quality at the same time. I could go on about all the elements of this project, but today we're focused just on that stream. But again, I want you to see how it's really at the heart of this neighborhood. And Hillside Court is a public housing complex up there on the right. And just to note, we're working on a Green Street project now to connect those residents down to the park. Go to the next one. And this was a plan back when I did different things. I drew this plan for the park way back when. At the time, it was a blank slate and there wasn't anything there. The park didn't even have a name. People didn't even know that it was a park. And so lots of things on this plan have come to light since. That trail that you see is in place to actually bring people closer to the stream. And then that area that was all grass, we called to do a 100-foot buffer. And that's what you're going to be looking at today with Lara. So that's been done. There used to not even be a bridge that crossed this creek. So kids were having to go down in the creek and back up just to get to school. There's a bridge now. So lots of things have happened, just having a plan and engaging the community throughout the process, because you know, you can just do a restoration project, but it really takes everybody to be a part of it in these situations. Go to the next one. So like I said, partners, this is just like a snapshot of some of the partners that have laid hands on this site and on this project. It's been going for years, and it's really important. Again, think outside of the box, think about people who you can bring in. That's Coca-Cola in the top right, doing a stream cleanup, just teaching stewardship and getting them involved. Isaac Walton League, we had volunteers doing benthic monitoring on that stream. The trail there to the left. So just be open to all types of funders, all types of partners, and get people engaged. Go to the next one. It's taken a minute to show. And not forget workforce development. Rob Jones was on the call earlier. I think he had to hop off, but this is aerial imagery of who knows when. It's pretty recent, because you can see now along the stream, you can see the little teenage buffer trying to pop in there. And Belmead has an enterprise center now that Groundwork RVA has a satellite office there. And they are training 18 to 24-year-olds in the city to be to get into the green business. And so they hold all of their landscape supplies there. They maintain the grounds of the school and the community center. We're going to be training them to maintain the bioretention areas and planters along the Green Street. As well as the city of Richmond has the Mayor's Youth Academy that spent some time in that riparian buffer this summer on learning how to maintain it. So particularly in urban environments, I think there's a real opportunity to engage people in workforce development around these buffers that we always say need maintenance, and there's no one to do maintenance. And you have these people who are dying to learn something. So think about those opportunities, and you don't have to do it alone. And there might be a partner around that also wants to get engaged. So I'm going to pass it over to Lara to get us into case study we walked around the other day together and took some photos. So Lara, are you with us from Alabama?
Yes. Can you hear me? Can everybody hear me? All right.
You're here. All right.
Yes. I apologize for any background noise. I'm in the middle of a park in Gulf Shores, Alabama. We're doing storm response after the series of hurricanes that have hit our southern states. And one of the things that some folks at Department of Forestry are part of our urban forest strike team. And so I'm down doing tree risk assessments for trees that have been impacted by Hurricane Sally. And it's an awesome call to action, and it's a really meaningful part of my job, but it's definitely sometimes challenging. So I'm really glad that I'm able to touch base with you all remotely today. I think everybody was wondering, am I going to be able to get in or not? But yeah, so this project I think is really meaningful for me. It was installed in 2013, and I've been involved off and on with this project since 2014. And it's a great case study example of some of the issues and some of the success stories that you can have from implementing an urban buffer in the middle of a neighborhood. And one of the rules that I have about urban buffers, even though they have a range of challenges, and we're going to discuss some of the challenges on this buffer because Amber and I met on site to kind of look at the buffer and assess what's going well, what isn't going well, what can we do to kind of make it better. And my number one rule is some buffer is better than no buffer. I think there's a lot of research behind, you know, the width of buffers has a great impact on water quality. But in cases like this, there's a football field, there's a community, there's a school, there's lots of potential conflicts, and there's just no way you can get to that 30 feet, 50 feet, 100 foot. So you have to sometimes work with what you have. And again, this site is so much better because the trees are there, because a buffer is there. And so that's just my number one rule when I'm approaching a buffer. And I work statewide. I've installed urban buffers all over the state, and that's kind of my number one rule. And it's kind of case by case by case basis. So they're all unique, but this is an excellent case study to kind of think about when you're going to approach an urban project. Next slide, please. So 7 years in, you know, we met out on site. Some of the big things that I saw and interfacing with the community over phases of this project as a urban forester, as an arborist, I can speak for the trees. You know, my expertise is related to trees and tree care. I can't speak for the stream bank stabilization issues on this site, some of the other bigger issues. The bridge installation was quite complicated and a lot of the trees had to be removed, but you know, you have to, I can speak to those issues, and those are the issues we're going to be really focusing on today. And one of the issues, if you note, recognized in the earlier plan that actually, I didn't know, Amber, you drew that, that's awesome, was that there was a really, on the side of the stream closest to the community, there was a really big buffer there. And one of the issues the community had with this was they wanted to have visual access to the waterway. They wanted to be able to have a clear line of sight when their children walked from the community over to the school and vice versa. And I've run into this issue multiple times with interfacing with urban buffers is you have to strategically think and plan for visual access to the waterway, because community members want to see their water feature. It's something that is part of that story of balancing aesthetics and function of your buffer. And if you can create these windows, if you can put in low-lying shrubs and really change the dynamic, you can have some water quality benefit, but also, and not have water quality benefit, but also do what the community wants. Because in order for this buffer to be successful, you have to have community buy-in. They have to be comfortable with the buffer that you're putting in. And I think I've learned this from this particular buffer. I've gone in, I've planted trees, they've been mowed down at least 3 times, you know what I mean? So like our foresters have gone in and planted trees. We've given trees to the community in Arbor Day and they've mowed them down. So I mean, I think as you want to maximize water quality benefits, but you need to have those real discussions with the community and what their desires are. And that window, that clear line of sight was critical for them. And we had to adjust, but the buffer's better because it's better than just a turf buffer because there are trees there and they're giving benefit. And back to the point, the second point here is you have to balance those aesthetics and function. You know, the community, having them involved in the project, having them helping maintain the project, seek those opportunities, and you're going to maximize those water quality benefits, but also the aesthetics of the project. The aesthetics are important. You know, when we knocked on doors for this project years ago, and, you know, one community member was like, I'm worried about crime because the grass was like waist high in this buffer and it was complicated. And she was like, I'm worried about crime and I want it mowed. You know what I mean? So you have to take those conversations in account when you're assessing a situation and dealing with an urban buffer. Next slide, please. One of the things that I crop into, the pictures are loading, awesome, okay. One of the things that I run into a lot with urban projects is they're an awesome opportunity to educate. You know, putting up tree ID signs, putting up educational signage related to water quality benefit are awesome, but you cannot forget to maintain these features. I've walked into a scenario where a group has done all this initial work and put in signage. These are the tree ID features like you see in the photo in the top, and then that person moves on and I come back 5 years later, 6 years later, and that strap is actually girdled the tree. So, you know, make sure you're thinking about and maintaining these projects throughout their life, because while educational signage is awesome and a great way to education your urban community with nature and interact with them, you need to make sure that they're maintained properly, because it's happened a lot more than I'd like to say, but it happens all the time. And you end up having to remove that tree because it's been girdled to death by educational signage. And that's really just not what you want. And then, you know, the other point I have in this slide is you have to make room, but prepare for wildlife. You know, wildlife is in urban areas, it's their home too. And you have to balance that sense of wonder local residents have with that nuisance factor that I think people think wildlife can bring. And, you know, Amber and I were on site and we saw a giant snapping turtle, and and 50 feet down from that, a woman was just hanging out in the creek, just hanging out, you know what I mean? So it's like, you have to be able to balance that. And the picture in the middle is actually deer rub. So you do get deer rub in the middle of the city, you know, you have to prepare for that because they can do damage. You know, we worked on projects and beavers have taken down trees in the middle of the city of Richmond and various other places. So you have to plan for wildlife and prepare your community and try to educate and eliminate some of those fears. And I put a picture from our DOF headquarters in the bottom right corner, because we ended up caging, you know, using welded wire cage material to really protect our trees. I know it was done in Richmond too with the low line because of the beavers, but things like that can really help you. They're aesthetically pleasing. They don't really, and they also help with some of the wildlife issues. But at DOF, we were having so much deer rub that we ended up having to weld wire cage all of the trees. Next slide. Delay. There we go. And I say the most prominent feature that is a problem on this site right now is just the mower blight and weed eater damage, you know. And I appreciated their creativity. You know, they actually cut the bottom out of a bucket, and tree guards work and they're awesome, but if you got a bucket and it's gonna protect your tree and it's actually cut on the side so it actually expands with the tree, you know, awesome. You know what I mean? You're doing your job, you're creating that buffer from the weed eater mower. And in my early years of interfacing with this project, there was a lot of vandalism issues and a lot of trees got damaged or pulled up or various other issues. And so you do have to acknowledge that when you're dealing with an urban buffer. But, you know, in the case of the river birch that's been damaged by the weed eater, it's got really good reaction wood. And, you know, it's when you're maintaining this buffer and thinking about it long term, some of those trees that have been damaged by weed eaters, you can just take them out and put something new. Just make sure you have the right protection and you're prepared, because aesthetics were really important to this community and having it mowed was really important to this community. And that was something that had to happen. And so you just have to prepare. And next visit to Richmond, I may just drop off some tree guards, just put them out there just to kind of help out. But yeah, so, but the biggest issue with that project is there. And, you know, Patti was really alluding to this, and invasives are a lifelong fight, but in urban areas and even with rural buffers, you just so have to pick your battles. And you know, ivy is in that middle picture, and it's prolific in urban areas, and it really does significant damage to trees. And you have to strategically think about how you're going to manage the invasives and come up with a plan. And I love how the community in this case has interacted with this buffer project. You know, there's JRA, other groups are doing volunteer work days, and, you know, they're actually clipping, I know that was probably Bob, but they're actually, you know, clipping vines. That's in a great way for a volunteer to help with invasives. Mechanical removal is a real option. You know, there's a lot of work going on in the city of Richmond with the Invasive Species Task Force and a lot of education going on, and it's great, but most of these volunteers don't have pesticide applicator license. They have tools, they have pruners, they have access to their hands and gloves, you know what I mean? So do what you can with volunteers and engage your community in the maintenance of this project, because once they're invested in the buffer, then they're gonna have a vested interest in making it successful, right? So, and then call in professionals for herbicide, chemical removal, and make sure that you're doing it properly, because the reality is a lot of these invasives need some type of chemical control, you know, even if it's just painting stumps or something very contact associated instead of broadcast, which I would recommend, particularly in a lot of urban areas, but you need to think through that. And some of these invasives do require chemical control. And then finally, you know, we were walking the trail around this buffer, and you always have to consider and mitigate risk. You know, worst case scenario, as a tree professional here in Alabama, looking at down trees, it's something that you have to think about. Trees do die. They are living things. They do decline and die. And this tree in the right corner was on the trail, and I consider that a high risk, and it needs to come down. And you do not want the community to be devastated and want to remove the trees from because of a scary tree, right? Something that comes down and affects the trail or makes a really loud bang. There's lots of consequences, and you have to be able to call in a professional to help you mitigate the risks, because in a rural buffer, when it's out in the middle of someone's field, it's not a big deal, but in an urban buffer, you do have to consider those things and take down trees that are risky. Don't even take a second guess at it. Next slide. You have to learn a little bit from your past mistakes. And I think one of the issues is tree spacing. You know, it's really tight spacing in this buffer, and you have to be able to, we're gonna have to thin it out as the years go by, because it's actually starting to close canopy now, and it was planted a little tight. So we just have to make some adjustments there. And finally, that tree in the bottom left corner, that was a caliper sized tree that was planted, and it was planted too shallowly. So it's going to create future problems for that tree, and you have to adjust. And then it's okay to do it in phases. You know, there's some really successful parts of this buffer, but there's a lot of turf there too. And I want to try to negotiate some shrubs in there, at least kind of layer into that buffer to get rid of some of that turf, to give people that clear line of sight, but also, you know, maximize water quality benefits. And finally, ask permission. You know, I've worked with this community for a few years, and I've given them trees, and we've been out there planting, and then, you know, they didn't have the permit. So you just need to make sure that you're following the right protocols within your community, planting the appropriate stock that's relevant, and ask permission and make sure you want this project to be successful. So plant, ask permission, and do all the right things. Next slide. I think that's it. No, there's one more slide. Yes, and finally, stay engaged. You know, you can have volunteer cleanup days, and you can clean there's a lot of trash in this buffer, and you can just, like she was showing earlier on, clean it up as much as you can, and engage with the community. And like I said, invest and consult professionals for big issues. Like that tree seriously needs to be removed, and there's some stabilization issues with that buffer, and you have to, I'm not a professional in that, but at least call someone to address it and see if it's really problematic or not necessary to change.
Awesome, thank you, Laura. You get the star for the presenter traveling from the furthest virtually today. So thanks so much for making time for joining us while
no problem.
Alabama. I mean, my goodness, how many people get to say that? So thanks to all of our panelists, Patti, Lara, and Amber. There's a question in the chat roll from Elizabeth about how do tubes compare to increasing tree planting density to mitigate deer browse? Who would like to address that good question? Others are welcome to add questions to the chat roll as well. And there are some other great bits of information that have been shared too by others. Patti, Laura, Amber, who would like to take that question?
Yeah, I can try and speak to it. I kind of on the rural side. I mean, certainly in the valley, I drove down 81 last week. I probably saw over a dozen deer standing on the side of 81, just chilling. And so, I mean, I've done a few projects where we've tried no tubes and tried non-deer preferred species. They're going to eat them. I mean, if they're hungry, if it's there, they're going to eat it. And cost-wise, yeah, it probably is cheaper to straight plant. But if part of your maintenance regime is going to include herbicide or mowing, those trees are awfully hard to see when you're doing a foliar application. That tube also provides a physical barrier to a foliar application that you can go ahead and spray your grass to control the grasses, and they're protected inside that shelter. So I think even just beyond the deer browse, they still provide maybe some other benefits and protection when you're doing some of your maintenance work. Does anyone else want to add to that?
This is Lara. I was just making sure I was unmuted. I'm on my phone. I completely agree with Patti on that. You know, deer, there's a lot of deer resistant cultivars of various trees and shrubs, and deer will eat them if they're hungry. And you have to think thoroughly about how you're going to protect the trees. And in this case, they were using buckets and the urban buffer. And I was like, bring it on, you know, like protect and you know, and like I said, for urban projects, they are expensive to install, but you have to think through in order for it to be successful, that kind of those maintenance needs and protecting it from wildlife.
Great, thanks, Lara. Thanks, Patti. Matt's also added to the chat roll that tubes also provide critical protection from rodents. And there's a hands-on volunteer work day at the park this Saturday from 9 to 12. Jane lets us know. So that's so cool. You can have a chance to go out and check out the buffer in person with your mask this weekend, your mask and your shovel this weekend as well. Are there other points or thoughts from others, reflection points from others, or questions that you want to add to the chat roll or just say? Right, so Emily has put the two links to the different resources that Amber mentioned into the chat roll. So those are here. Jim has mentioned that when he worked in Africa, he had baboons pulling up the trees. That's a totally different set of considerations. And on our last presentation, on our last meeting, David Wise, who's on the call today as well, also talked about stone mulch. It's been a really strong area of interest for consortium members and how that's been helpful with voles particularly as well. So a lot of different considerations here. Amory has just also said, your point about wildlife wonder versus nuisance in the buffer planting area was an interesting point to keep in mind as well. So panelists, any other thoughts you want to add to some of these baboons to wildlife considerations before we get ready to wrap up our panel today?
This is Lara, and you would be surprised. Like I said, the low line in the city of Richmond, Amber was affiliated with this project, and they loved the river birch, and they would literally come out of the canal in downtown Chaco Bottom, cut down the river birches, drag them into the canal. And I mean, it happens. And dogs, cats, birds, you know, like, and you're just like, I'm in the middle of the city of Richmond. There's no way that the beavers are going to come.
And they would do it overnight. Overnight,
Yeah.
you'd come back and they'd be gone.
Yeah, and it was only the river birches, you know, like the service berries, the fringe trees, every other tree down there. They really liked those river birches, and it's just, you have to adapt, and you are going to lose trees, and that's why I said earlier, you know, work with these buffers in phases, come back in, do pulse checks, make sure that it's successful, because, you know, you're gonna feel defeated if you don't laugh a little bit. You know, that one buffer was just amazing, you know, and this one's amazing too, and I think we're doing so much good work with putting these buffers and interacting with communities and asking them what they want, and we don't want the buffer to not be successful because we're not addressing issues like wildlife, you know, interacting with wildlife, and we need to think about that when we're putting in urban areas, because we're creating habitat. So
Lara, Amber, Patti, anything else you want to add before we wrap up our panel?
No, I saw one comment way up from Andrea Bowles to everyone, that they are in Albemarle County are monitoring and working on maintaining buffers, and they're in year 7 with theirs. And they just said, Patti, your presentation was very helpful in understanding what goals that they should have in mind during that. So just giving that shout out because it might have got lost up there.
Yeah, thank you, Amber. This is Andrea. It really was helpful because we're managing that project, and in 3 years, DEQ does not provide input on what we need to do to maintain, and then we need to do that, and we want to do that. So that's really good information to help us for planning for the future. Thanks.
Thank you.
That's helpful feedback too. Any other comments or reflection points from anyone as we consider teenage trees and human beings? All right, well, let's thank Patti, Lara, and Amber. Round of applause, snaps, claps, reactions. Let's thank them for joining us today. Lara, you look prepared in every way a person might be prepared. So thanks so much for joining us. We wish you safety in your work and appreciate you joining us today. So thank you.
no problem. I'm going to go get back to work. See you all later.
Sounds great. Thanks, Lara. Thanks, Patti, as well, and Amber. So we're going to have a 10-minute break, and we're going to be moving into our second panel of the day, Why Conservation Made Sense, Stories from the Field. We invite you, if you have just joined and you haven't introduced yourself yet, to put your name and affiliation in the chat roll. Folks had a chance to do networking sessions earlier, so we will be sharing a registration list. So if you don't want us to share your information only with other participants, please let us know. But otherwise, we hope you'll take the chance to connect with folks after the session today. So again, thanks so much to our panelists for joining. We really appreciate it. And Amber, I'm going to turn it over to you to introduce folks while I get ready to pull the slides up. So welcome back, everybody, from your break.
Great. So our next panel is Why Conservation Makes Sense, Stories from the Field. And we've got Bill Brawford calling in today. He is retired from the Department of Forestry in 2002. He was the water quality specialist. And he is the owner of the Brawford family farm and produces calves, feeder cattle, and hay. He currently has a part-time forestry consulting business as well called Blue Chip Forestry. On this panel, we've also got Matt Ehrhart with the Stroud Water Research Center. He's the director of watershed restoration there, and his work is primarily focused on water quality, watershed restoration, agricultural conservation and preservation, and is and any associated policy and implementation issues. And we call him all the time with questions also. And I will note the November 12th meeting that we have coming up for the consortium, we will be visiting Bill Brawford's farm. So you'll have a chance to actually see this in real life if you'd like. So without further ado, I'll pass it over. I think Bill's going first, right?
Yeah, Bill's first. Okay, great. Thanks, Amber.
Oh, okay. Am I ready yet?
You're ready.
You're ready to go.
All right. So we'll get a slide or two. I'm going to go a little bit into my history, I guess. And it's going to be more of a motivational thing and then whatever I've done and what worked out, what did not work out. But I was retired from the Virginia Department of Forestry from 1973 up until 2002. And so the first thing I'd ever heard of buffers would be in forestry. And we used to have a conversion to pine. So we used a drum chopper, which was pulled by a bulldozer. And where you couldn't get close to the creek, that was the buffer. Since then, things have changed. This is a tract of the Mullins tract that was reforested in 1986. Buffers were left. Next slide. And it was reharvested again a few years ago. It was 2015, I believe. But that buffer is still there. So the main reason it was there was just more simple to flag the buffers off and leave it all together. I had hoped to be able to harvest individual trees in there, but that's difficult. So talk about long-term buffers, that's an example. Next slide. All right, and so I did retire in 2002, moved back to the family farm in 2003, and kind of go into the history of that before we talk about buffers. This house was built in, I guess, about 1812, and that's a picture of it on the far upper right. An overview of the farmstead is on the upper left, and the lower left is when my grandfather owned it from about 1919 to 1960. And the bottom right is more or less current. So that's kind of the history of the land. Okay, next slide. So the question is, okay, here's my grandfather, 1942. So he's been in the cattle business for quite some time, was a merchant at Natural Bridge Station downtown. Next slide. So, and then my father took over or bought him out in about the 1950s, and we actually moved back to the family farm in 1963. Slide. And this is our actually the view behind me right now, but this is our view shed from our house, so it's important that we maintain our view. There's a pond to the left, and we actually can see the fog over the James River in the background. James River is on this side of the large mountains, on the far side of the tree canopy there. Okay, next slide. So my father would never have stood for fencing off buffers. We, you know, one of the essentials for grazing is to have water for the cattle. And we did have some water troughs, but the cows are kind of like people. They enjoy a spa, and this was their more or less refuge during the heat of the day. And next slide. So we, since about 2015, since we put in the buffers, we've substituted deer for cows. So I think there's less pressure from the deer, but we definitely have more of a deer habitat than we did before. Next slide. So I think it was 2015 or 2016. There's a cost share program that we signed up through the Soil and Water Conservation District. And lo and behold, they recommended a series of waterers to allow us to put in stream buffers. In addition to the buffers, we instituted a grazing rotational system that rotates from one paddock to the other. These are not all subdivided, but I have about 5 or 6 different pastures that we rotate the cows probably on a weekly basis. This is an overview of the farm, and the colored areas is our farm. The neighboring is not colored. Next. I'd like to kind of zero in on one of the buffers, the outline in red. If you can look at the overview, there's 2 separate drainages. The one that's outlined is a smaller stream. The one in the upper part of the screen is our home, our farmstead, and the pond, and the larger stream goes to the buffer going down to the right. And so let's zoom into this smaller area. And so this is the aerial view of the before buffers. You can see the ditch bank overview that goes south. And there's, where the arrow was an original waterer that it didn't really do the trick because it just picks up spring water from the pasture area. And about August and September, it pretty much went dry, so it was not quite adequate. And the cattle tended to get down in the ditch bank and drink their water and cool off a little bit. So that was probably the higher priority of what I wanted to fence the cattle from. Next slide. And this is the overview of the buffer. In addition to the buffer along the stream, we also fenced that a portion of the woodland. Was hesitant about doing the whole woodland because it needed some cattle shade. So the buffer encompasses both woods, steep woodland, and also the edge of the buffer. And it's probably about 30 to 40 feet. The fence is mostly woven wire, and so let's go to the next slide and see the ground view of it. So one of the ideas I had was to plant pine on these areas of the buffer so that I could get some return on the investment sometime down the line. And so I planted across between pitch and loblolly pine. This particular area is on the larger creek, down below the house in the view shed, and had varying results. I sprayed the area to plant about a 4-foot circle in the fall, and planted it with loblolly pine the following spring. And this whole area is somewhat shaded, very, very deep, heavy sod. The trees did okay the first 2 or 3 years, but after that they all died. So had a lot to do with competition from heavy fescue and a little bit too much shade. And the next slide. So the other part that I did on the smaller stream came out better. And we can go to the next slide, I think. And so this is about 5-year-old lob pitch. And this, if you'll go back, if you'll think about the red bracketed area, that would have been the area where the loblolly pine did pretty well. The bad part about that is I did have some overstory trees, and it had a new fence, and trees tend to fall on the fence if it's new, especially. So that takes us back to 2015 initial project. Got 100% cost share. I would never have envisioned putting up much water line from a well that was paid for by cost share. And so this is 2-inch PVC pipe. And that was, I guess, the process of putting in about 6 waters initially. Okay, next slide. So these are Ritchie waterers, 6 of those, 1 in the adjoining field to the house. Later put in a 7th waterer that goes off from the same well. And so that's part of the cost share program. Get next. This is the last buffer I did. It's on my sister's land along Route 130. I did it for 2 reasons. I do have a combination of pine, shortleaf pine, and mixed hardwoods. This was a buffer, and it was pretty steep to mow, so that was reason for putting that in. It is a stream at the bottom between the highway and the stream. Okay, next. So to sum it up, the questions I was asked is why stream buffers are on our farm. Well, advantages, I think it's provided cleaner water for cows, instituted rotational grazing, created some habitat diversity, which the guy that rents my land for hunting appreciates. Stream bank protection, I was very concerned about that. And the downstream neighbors are a concern for their well-being and complaints. Maybe haven't really had any complaints. Also, cattle need to be observed. It's hard to observe them in the stream banks. And I was looking at future utilization of the buffers also. The disadvantages, more to maintain. I've had to do some repair work on the pipeline and fencing and making sure the waters keep on working. It's more time required for the rotational grazing. It's more difficult to control invasive species and buffers, which means probably backpack instead of equipment spraying. Less shade for cows. And there's some sacrifice for the most productive pasture along streams. Also, the view shed, I need to limit the height of of the trees that I look out my front door. And then another thought would be access. It may cut off access to some of our fields. I ran into that problem with some salvage of ash that I needed to do last year. And it pretty much wraps it up. I think I have a question or two which I missed out.
Great. Well, let's go ahead and there was one question about where your farm is, Bill, and I actually had a question about what your stocking rates are for the rotational grazing. How many cows do you have in a given area in the rotational grazing before you move them approximately?
Okay, we're located on the James. We're about a mile from the James River, so our creek empties pretty soon right into the James, right at the Natural Ridge Station location. We have about 50 brood cows, and I have probably another 20 feeder calves that I may maintain on a separate pasture. Usually each paddock is about 20 acres, and so I would rotate them routinely. The total number of acres that I graze is about 200 acres, and that's certainly adequate this year. Last year I had to feed some hay before grazing season was over.
Great, thank you. Any other questions from Mr. Brawford? All right, we're going to continue to welcome those in the chat role. And Bill, thanks so much for your presentation. Really awesome to see the transition of the land over time. Now we're going to turn it over to you to continue why conservation made sense, and then we'll continue to have time for questions and discussions at the end. So Matt, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Christine. I do want to just say, as we get started, we've had the great pleasure at Stroud of working with the consortium sort of from the north out of the watershed. And excuse me, I just want to call out that I think this is one of the more functional and effective collaborations I see. And I think it's both a testament to everybody who participates and to the organization and structure of it. So I really have enjoyed getting to work with you all. So I was asked to talk a little bit about multifunctional riparian buffers, and I guess this word always twists me a little bit the wrong way, because every buffer is multifunctional, and James Davis Martin talked a little bit at the very beginning about some of those co-benefits that are really important. What people really mean when they say this these days is some kind of economic production in the buffer area. And this isn't the first time, we've had conversations about this. I think the first time I was involved in discussions about this was probably about 25 years ago. And there's reasons why that conversation is still around. So if we could move to the next slide, please. I'll try to address this from a, sort of from a higher level, and we can dig into whatever details people are interested in. It's worth noting that, folks are investing hundreds of thousands of dollars in these production-focused buffers. NRCS has certainly been involved, and you can see the diagram they use. I do want to note, that zone 1, the functionality that we're looking for in our buffers is pretty critical, and NRCS calls that out in sort of this unmanaged or native buffer for a number of reasons. But what folks are really thinking about typically are, the production of edibles or florals or energy from this acreage that we're talking about in the buffer. Next slide, please. And as we think about how to do that effectively, it's sort of important, I think, to keep in mind why we're focused on buffers in the first place. This is an old graphic that still works really well. It speaks to how we tend to think about buffers as filters for the landscape, and they certainly work that way. sorry, I just got distracted. I saw deer edibles too, and I completely agree. um, so I also, it's worth noting here that this is how the models see our buffers as filters. The Chesapeake Bay models, the models we use for our local water quality and TMDLs and MS4s and all the other host of acronyms that we deal with in the regulatory world, they see buffers as filters. Next slide, please. But this goes back to what James said initially. There's a lot of really important functionality that forested buffers provide that aren't accounted for in just how our nutrient models look at them. You know, the habitat and temperature regulation, the improved food web that comes from organic contributions from forests, and the fact that we know these systems are more biologically active than meadow streams, and provide some unique options for us there. So we don't want to lose that as we think about adding other functionality. Next slide, please. And so to jump back to production, there's so much variability on our farms and our ag landscape, and so it introduces a lot of things for people to think about. If you're a 60 cow dairy on 80 acres and you've got everything in crop except for 5 or 8 acres of pasture that's down along the stream, thinking about your buffers feels a little differently than if you've got a few hundred acres and you're running a beef operation and you've maybe got a little more land to play with. And that's, sort of just a start in terms of the scale. Then you've got to think about what you might want to do with it. You want to think about edibles and what's the timing of that. Or, if you plant raspberries in there, you're going to be harvesting sooner than if you plant something like elderberries in the photo here. Or if you want to think about walnuts and pawpaws, you're even on a longer production cycle. So thinking about things like that, if you're thinking about florals, are you thinking about shrubby dogwoods and red stem dogwoods, things like pussy willows, which maybe have a certainly a market, but are non-native? What does that mean? If you're thinking about things like winterberry and seasonal plants, how do you get winterberry clippings with the berries off before the birds eat your berries? There's a lot of details. And on the energy side, it gets a little more complex because of the markets for energy. Right now, biofuels are having a really hard time competing with natural gas prices where they are. And that's a cyclical thing. Folks plant shrubs or switchgrass, and by the time they get to a place where they can harvest them, the energy prices have changed and it may not work. So there's a lot of interest, but there's also a lot of realities to think through. Next slide, please. So there are some questions to think about in terms of if we've been talking about this for 25 years, and I would say maybe this is the third significant wave of interest. Why are we still talking about it and not doing more of it? Why aren't people making money here? So I think the primary thing we forgot early on is that farmers are really busy. If you're talking to a guy who's managing a dairy or poultry operation and beef and crops, the idea that they're going to sort of create time to learn all about a new crop and figure out how to harvest it when they've got hay coming in or other real needs, it gets a little messy for a lot of the producers. And that was probably the early lesson that we blew it on, frankly, the first time through. Next slide, please. The market piece is also really complicated. And so you've got to have the capacity and the knowledge to get it to market. Maybe that's a roadside stand. Getting products placed in grocery stores is a whole industry. And that was another thing we blew it on early on. We just didn't understand it. You know, people actually buy shelf space to put things in supermarkets, and you have to have a critical mass of product to go into that market. Or you have to know, you know, if the local florist is getting all of their material through one or two suppliers, the odds that they're going to complicate their life to get red stem dogwood from you might be pretty small. So that was another thing that has been a hurdle. Next slide, please. The other reality that we bumped into pretty quickly was there's a reason a lot of these acres are in pasture right now. A lot of them aren't conducive to mechanized equipment, and where they would have been in crops from the beginning. You know, these are just two examples of areas that are now buffer before they went into buffer, and between the terrain and the wet areas and seeps, it really means that we're talking about hand harvesting in many of these areas, which limits your options and certainly has some impacts on efficiency. So I actually thought of the other thing we blew it on, frankly, is that in those early stages, the funding sources we were using, so I would say the first wave was near the inception of the discussion about buffers, and there just weren't a lot out there, and it was probably a little early to think about it. The second wave of discussions, at least in Pennsylvania, that focused on sort of some other economic production, was happening while the CREP program was really robust and effective. So folks were enrolling buffer acres in CREP. They were getting an annual rental rate. The CREP program that provided the rental rate didn't allow for harvesting. It's a land set-aside program. So it was just a bit of a disjunct nature of that conversation between, you know, something harvestable and the program. And I think now that we're using more diversified funding, it certainly puts us in a different set of opportunities to think about some of these options. Next slide. So in thinking about, you know, the paths forward that can really work for us, CSAs, or community supported agriculture, is really, I think, one of the places that we are seeing this start to work. You know, you have operations whose whole business plan is modeled around harvesting a number of different crops through a number of different seasons. They have a market already developed that's using their that's their consumer base, and so to introduce you know, floral components or, you know, pawpaws as in the picture, you know, it's not something that's foreign. It's not a completely new business venture. It's just adding some opportunities and components to what they're already doing. And I think that's probably the simplest way this works, frankly. Next slide, please. Another thing that we're really thinking about is how do we more effectively manage this reality of these small acreages and long linear buffers into a, you know, a consumer product. And one of the options people are looking at is really having one entity who's doing the management and harvesting of the crop in this area, and trying to do that through leases over buffers on a number of different farm operations. So rather than having each one of these farms try to figure out, you know, what to grow and how to market from their buffer, you have one entity who's contracting out to do that. And this is, you know, these are Lancaster County farms, Lancaster County, Pennsylvania farms, and obviously what's currently pasture is probably what ought to be buffer. But so it gives you a sense of some of the challenges of scale that I mentioned earlier as well. But I think this idea of sort of consolidating the resource from a production standpoint has some merit. Next slide, please. So the other piece of this that I think is critical and we're thinking about doing is the market development side. And I want to give a little bit of a shout out to the folks at Propagate Ventures. You can search them on the web. They are probably one of the groups at the forefront of trying to figure out how to develop agroforestry opportunities and markets. Good guys. I was hoping to be a little farther along. We're doing some work with them on market development for buffer grown products, and COVID has slowed that down a little bit. So we don't really have the outcomes to talk about yet, but we're really looking at a set of farms and management plans and market development opportunities to try to figure out how to tee this up and take another crack at it in a way that maybe has a little more chance for success. But this is, like I said earlier, this is really, I think, the hard part, the marketing piece of this. Next slide, please. And so I'll stop it there. I'd love to get into questions and discussions. Before we leave, I do want to come back to this fact that there are a lot of values associated with the buffers, in addition to reductions in nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment for the Chesapeake Bay or our local streams. These are the things we hear from buffer landowners about after the fact. I never realized how many birds I would see. I think there's a lot more amateur birders out there than we guess. People who just love to see these guys in their buffers. Pollinators are a critical issue now in a way we would never have thought about a decade ago. We need refugia for native pollinators and habitat for them to help offset the crisis we have with honeybees right now. And these areas certainly have a lot of potential for that, both at an herbaceous layer, but also the woodies serve as habitat, critical habitat and food for native pollinators during different parts of the year. We're working with some farmers who see their buffer as their white-tailed deer hotspot. Most of them are archery hunters, stories of 150, 160-inch class bucks out of their buffers. They're really excited about it. And sometimes it just, comes down to simpler things like, a family who tells us, we haven't had a place to picnic on the farm since my grandfather owned it. And now, it wasn't part of the intent at the beginning, but now they have a place to go and do family activities, hang out on a Sunday afternoon, and maybe get a little fishing in with the kids. Just a different kind of value for those areas. So I'll stop there. I really appreciated Bill's presentation as a little bit of juxtaposition to this. So I'm looking forward to questions.
Thanks so much, Matt. I am so proud of our presenters for staying on time. You're making my job so easy, so thank you. Matt, I'm going to give you a chance to read out some of the comments that have come in and see how you'd like to weave them together. Bill, there's a question for you from Alex. So I'm going to go to your question first and then come back to you, Matt. Alex asked, have your buffer installments attracted attention from nearby neighbors, potentially encouraging such practices on their properties? Bill, how about that one?
The main attraction would be along the highway or the road in front of us. They were, I've had about 5 or 10 comments from the tree shelters, which were put in last year. Other than that, not a lot. It's not easily seen.
Great, thanks, Bill. So Matt, I'm going to let you just string together the responses as you'd like to based on some of the fun feedback that's come back in the chat. I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a minute and refresh slides. So I'm just going to turn it over to you. And Bill, if there are more questions that come in for you as well, then we'll come back to them. So Matt, over to you.
Yeah, so, I think there's been ongoing interest from, since the 70s in biofuel potential and trying to figure out, just noting Panicum Virgatum being mentioned there. It really is cyclical. When fuel prices go up, there's this surge of interest. Unfortunately, it seems like until that surge of interest gets turned into implementation, biofuel or fuel prices have gone back down, and then guys get stuck without any demand. I know Cal Ernst from Ernst Seeds, you know, they had a big biofuel operation. They were shipping pelletized switchgrass and shrub fuel to Europe because the carbon markets made sense to do it. Now they're putting that material in silt socks because it's really the only market they have for it. And then they're making a lot less money. So you know, I think it's just never, the demand has never stayed robust enough for long enough to really make things take off. I've heard a couple of conversations about folks growing mushrooms in buffers, you know, particularly in mature buffers where you've got the soil and the dead wood and things to make that work, which is a great opportunity if that's your gig. And Keith mentioned the cost of buffer establishment. Certainly one of the drivers for trying to make these forest buffer areas economically viable is to try to create a funding stream. You know, that if there's money to be made, folks will be willing to make the investment in the buffer without looking for grant money or program money to do it, and maybe accelerate implementation. That, you know, it'd be great to get to that point. We're certainly still trying to figure out how to get there.
Thanks, Matt. How about questions from others? Looks like Anne Marie has asked about an interest in Bill's 2019 project. Do you plan to harvest the pines that are mixed in with the hardwoods later on, or leave them in?
Oh, it'll be a while. Yes, that was the original thought. I don't know how well the survival is going to be though. So I would think, you know, it's going to be about 30 years, but certainly they were planted with the idea of harvesting, doing some harvesting in the future. The problem here again is Matt had mentioned is that, you know, the up and down markets. I've got ash that, you know, 20 years ago, everybody would be cutting firewood. Now it's like nobody wants firewood.
Yeah.
That's a change in times. Absolutely. Although I wonder this winter, I imagine we'll see a little bit of difference probably this year, maybe in that.
Oh, if
How
we
about
haven't all put our natural gas stoves in.
That's right. That's right. How about, we have about 5 more minutes or so for questions and discussion. How about questions from others? Would you like to just share them? Old fashioned out loud is welcome too, or feel free to put them in the chat roll too, or other reflection points from folks too.
This is
All
right. And I'm sorry, I was really loud during this conversation. Sorry to distract you, Matt, with my deer comment.
No.
But I have yet another question for you. It occurs to me that, you know, on our land, the buffer is the most productive piece of the property, but it's productive in a way that it does a little bit of this and a little bit of that and not a lot of one thing. The way that in, you know, monoculture type agriculture, we can put a monetary number to that productivity much more easily with a pasture, for example. And I was wondering if you've seen anybody write about that, about how the stream corridor provides very specific benefits to a farm, or, you know, to the area around it, in kind of monetary terms, or it's that relationship between the stream corridor and the farm. And I'm thinking about, just for example, a lot of the aquatic organisms that live in the stream bottom, and their functionality with, you know, the creatures that we're raising for production.
Yeah, so there've been there's been a lot of anecdotal conversation about that. You know, I think it's been hard for folks to put numbers around. For a while, there was a really robust conversation in the veterinarian community about the economic value of getting your cows out of the stream. And, you know, some of that is a little easier in terms of hoof health, and some of it's a little harder in terms of, you know, cows not having gastro problems because they're not drinking polluted water out of the stream. And while they couldn't put, you know, sort of veterinary treatment numbers on that, we had people talking about increases in milk production and trying to, you know, after they had their cows out of the stream and drinking clean water from waters. There are, you know, we see a lot of streams that have huge black fly populations while the cows have access to them, and you know, and those black flies have an impact on cow health and comfort, and you know, at some level, along with a lot of other things, that plays into production. And that's, so that, you know, just a handful of things that are really related to livestock production. Folks have tried, but it is so variable, you know, from farm to farm to farm, depending on their operation and management and you know, what livestock they're growing, beef or dairy cows or horses. So I haven't ever seen really good sort of compiled numbers about that, but it is definitely on a lot of farmers' minds. I'll say particularly dairy farms whose you know, animals are not very athletic, and who, you know, they want to keep them up out of those areas. It improves, you know, calving success. It improves herd health and production. I hope that answered your question, or if you were going a different direction, let me know.
That's helpful. Thank you.
Thanks, Laurel. Thanks, Matt. Questions from others or comments? Amber's included in the chat roll that co-benefits may need to lead the way. You know, that's where the real motivation for people might be in those co-benefits, as well as the good points that have been made about time, availability, markets, interest. A lot of considerations here. So last call, any kind of closing thoughts from our panelists or additional questions from anybody?
I'll just share a quick comment. There were some surveys done of CREP landowners years ago, and I think it was multiple states. I think maybe Maryland, possibly Virginia, and Pennsylvania. And it was a pretty clear pattern that the motives for people for putting buffers in, there was a lot of interest in birds, nuts, fruits, but it wasn't for commercial benefit. It was for simply wildlife use. So it's going to be a really niche community. I think that the economics of it really appeals to, and I think there's a much broader base of interest just in the ecological side of multifunctional benefits. So
Great, thanks, Dave. That's helpful.
Those respondents categorically said, we are interested in these things, and when it came to the economic question, they said we are categorically not interested. Pretty strong pattern in those surveys.
Okay.
That's probably early 2000s.
Okay, that's helpful. Any brief final remarks, Bill, Matt?
Thanks for having me here, and I, you know, if folks have pieces of this that they'd love to talk about later, or details or opportunities, feel free to reach out.
Great, thank you.
So I guess, thank you. I've had lots of experience, lots of it doing the wrong things, and which is beneficial, I guess, to learn things. And one other comment I had heard was that maybe farmers could use more flexibility on the width of the buffer. They would be willing to do more if they didn't have to leave quite so large a buffer.
Great, that's a great point. So let's thank Matt and Bill for presentations again, those reactions, snaps, claps, round of applause. encourage you to use them. Thanks so much, Bill and Matt. Really appreciate your time and expertise and stories. So thank you. I want to encourage all of you, as Amber's getting ready to introduce Devin, to take a stretch break, stand up, and mimic your favorite tree. We can see you even if your video's off, so we'll know if you're stretching or not. So, you know, I'm just kidding on that. Do a couple jumping jacks, stretch your arms out, move your body around. We have lunch break. We're super excited that Devin's here, so keep your energy up. And I'll turn it over to you, Amber, to introduce Devin.
Awesome. Thanks, Christine. And thanks, Matt and Bill. So yeah, next up we have the panel title is Alluvial Riparian Natural Plant Communities of Our Region, Biodiversity, Assessment, Restoration, and Stewardship. And leading us in this talk is Devin Floyd. I've got so many papers here. So Devin is the director and founder of Center for Urban Habitats. And he provides expertise and leadership for inventory, monitoring, and management of natural resources for public entities in Central Virginia. He continues to be a pioneer in the place-based learning movement, inspiring the next generation of stewards to build knowledge from the ground up, rooted in local contexts. So, Devin, over to you.
All right, you hear me? Just
Yep.
fine? All right.
Yep.
Thanks for having me, everybody. Really good to see familiar faces and names. And I'll just dive right in and say that I have incorporated basically a semester's worth of information into 20 slides. And I'm going to kind of pound through them and just warn you that I'm not providing answers. These are meant to stretch your craniums a little bit, make you ask some questions, maybe question the way you've been doing things. Just keying off of what David and William said. And the concerns of Laurel, you know, this is a really complicated issue, and it's something we don't know much about. This thing about conserving and managing natural resources and balancing that with population growth and economy. So, without further ado, let's jump to the first slide, and I will go ahead and I guess begin with a quote. My wife said the other day. She said, "We are consumed with a modern fixation, planting trees. We've been led to believe that trees can solve every environmental ill, and we seem to be stuck with a very incomplete story that goes like this. Trees are good, the end." So I suggest it's time to learn the rest of the story. So I'm going to be focused on mostly on the grasslands end of this. Next slide, please. What we're going to cover today is outlined here, and very briefly, those three major parts. I am going to cover the riparian communities that we know we have in the James River watershed in Central Virginia. I'm going to spend some time with what's being called the forgotten grasslands, and then I'm going to share with you our methodology for how we pull off restorations on degraded landscapes. And finally, we'll give a quick brush over review and do some Q&A. I hope to leave about, I don't know, 7 or 8 minutes for Q&A at the end. So keep me on track. Next slide. Oh, that one's missing. Oh, there she is. Butterfly loaded slow. It must have been a big picture. So I need to introduce some definitions before we move forward. They're native plants and what is a natural community anyway. So most of you are familiar with versions of these definitions. We've long been using a cultural version of a definition of native, adhering to state lines and county lines. And were we to redo that map, we would use ecoregions if you wanted a more accurate, and maybe local niche-based maps. Very complicated map, something that all the insects probably see every day. But there's a definition there. The key there is that enough time has passed for them to develop complex relationships with their environment in all parts of it. That best defines a native plant. Okay, next slide. And very closely related to that are natural plant communities. They have a very similar definition. A natural plant community is, again, a grouping of living organisms, in this situation plants, that have had enough time to develop complex relationships with each other, with the animals, with the soils, geology, all the physiographic elements. But really importantly, Many of them have been disturbed, but that doesn't mean they're not natural plant communities. If they've had enough time to recover, or if the disturbance was minimal, they can also assume their long-standing natural characteristics. All right, so with those definitions out of the way, let's move on to looking at some actual natural plant communities in the area. Next slide. I'm going to start broad, and this is sort of how things are classified. There's a scheme for breaking down all the ecosystems that we call natural communities. The three broad classes that you guys are all dealing with along streams are those: terrestrial, palustrine, and riverine. The ones on the terraces themselves are mostly palustrine, and I did these sketches here before the presentation. They're kind of rough, but they laid out pretty well. There's a number of things you can see in there. You guys can revisit after I explain some of these things, like prairie and savanna and all of that, at a later date. But the reason I have two drawings here is because we have broad river floodplains, and we also have dissected uplands with small streams, and those settings are equally important when it comes to the buffer zone. That's kind of, we end up with a lot of cattle in those areas. In dissected uplands, there is no floodplain, but there are ecosystems tight right down to the stream. So I'm including that here. There's two divisions, lowland and upland. Next slide, please. All right, so that's my crew doing some survey work over there. We spend a few days a week documenting, classifying natural communities. And the Department of Conservation and Recreation has a wonderful website, which I link as a resource at the end of this slide presentation. It lays all of this out pretty well, but what I've gone in and done for you guys is to break out a few that are critical to this region and to the context we're talking about. But in the state, there are roughly 300 different natural plant communities. That's the whole state. In any given county in the state, you can expect between 50 and 60 natural community types. That is 50 to 60 predictable ecosystem types, and they're very definable and recognizable, with some significant variation across the landscape. And if you get within that county level, you just look at floodplains, the buffer zone, palustrine. 20 natural community types seem to be occurring strictly in association with the stream terraces. There's a whole pile more in dissected uplands. So let's go into the next slide. And this is a quick brush over. So I've given 3-hour presentations on this slide. Here they all are. And what I've done to make this communicate a little bit better is broken this in half. There are forests and there are not forests. And the reason I've got this sort of 50-50 laid out, it will become apparent momentarily, is forests and grasslands shared most landscapes equally, roughly equally. The percentages are debatable, but 50-50 is a safe estimate right now for most of the last 10,000 years. And so over here on the right side, we've got this grassland and shrublands. You guys are familiar with these. These include everything from all those little, those stretches of rush out in the pasture after you've hayed and you've run cattle through. Those are kind of remnant marshes. You've got the oxbow, the ponds back in the floodplains. Down the very bottom on the right side, I want you guys to take a look. Prairies, savannas, and woodlands. These are grassland types that are completely extirpated from floodplains. They don't exist in our region anymore. There are remnants, very small ones. Beaver have also declined. They used to create significant wet prairies and savannas along our streams. We have some excellent examples of those in the area. So let's move on to the next slide. Oh, this one doesn't look like, oh, good. The image loaded. Okay, so let's dive into the forgotten grasslands. This is kind of the second of 3 parts. Looking at the time check, 12:04. Looks like we're doing okay. All right, so I think, yeah, I'll go ahead and start with a quote here again. Author Stephen Pine, he's emeritus professor at Arizona State University. He specializes in environmental history, particularly the history of European exploration. So here's the quote. "It was not forests of the New World that startled the colonists and strained their vocabulary, but the grasslands instead. The virgin forest was not even encountered in the 16th and 17th centuries. It was invented in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. So that is a good lead in. Many of you may not be aware of this, but we're finding, based on remnant grasslands scattered about the region, that a significant portion of our landscape was savanna in this area. And I mean 20 different kinds of savanna, really complex matrix. Forests were here and they were awesome. But the complex was, the landscape was a lot more complicated than it is now. And I should say, before we leave this slide, that the Monacan Indian Nation was managing and living in and with this landscape. And their decline is related to the exact same force that caused the decline of the grasslands. So you can't really separate them from conversation. Floodplains were their haunt. That's where they did their agriculture. So let's move on to the next slide. The next slide should be, yeah, this idea. Okay, so I think that you guys have probably all been brainwashed like I was when I was a kid by this notion that a squirrel could leap from limb to limb from the Atlantic to the Mississippi without touching the ground because of the virgin forest. Well, turns out we have all been duped and lied to, and the romantic writers and the artists of the early 1900s are partially responsible. But I share this image here because it demonstrates something. In the top image you see on the right, there's American chestnut trees. Those things are massive. And on the left, you have this map produced in 1925 showing black. That was all presumed forest. You see that little arc down in Alabama, that's a black belt prairie. But these pictures of these big trees you guys have all seen were taken on the steep slopes of Appalachia. And the other ones are taken out in the Great Dismal Swamp. They weren't taken in the Piedmont. So a little food for thought. Down at the bottom, there's actually an oak savanna in the Piedmont on the left. That's a 500-year-old grassland, at least. On the right, there's a map showing yellow. Grassland types covered that entire area in a matrix with forest types. A very complicated landscape. Let's move on to the next slide. So to fuel this, I want to give you guys a few maps. This one is one produced based on John Lederer's explorations. And if you see in the center of the map right above the eye, where it says Virginia broken up into like 4 parts, right above the first eye, those are the Southwest Mountains. The Ravenna splits and goes through the gap there at Charlottesville. Yeah, there we go. Somebody's putting the cursor on it. See the Savannah labeling the massive valley right up above it. Savannah is Latin plural for savanna, which just means a matrix of open spaces, meadows, groves. So that's one map. Next. The next map is probably going to be, yes, my favorite. This is a fire map, and this does not include human fires added to the mix. So you can kind of squint and see Albemarle County in there, Buckingham, Amherst, Nelson, right in the middle. And there's that orange belt that wraps up through there that fire ecologists now think, because of the flat plains, the low ecological or physiographical relief, burned every 1 to 3 years. That's very frequent. You cannot get forest development with that kind of burning. In the area that's green, that's 7 to 12 years. You can't get a closed canopy forest development in that setting. You're looking at woodlands and savannas. So this map presents some alternative thinking with respect to that 1925 map that was produced. Next slide. The next slide is one that we're beginning to produce that we just started working on. Looks like it's not loading. Well, it'll probably load. There it goes. Okay, so I just want you to see the yellow. That's the prevalent, that's the region that would have harbored savannas, hypothetically. What we're doing right now is mapping remnant grasslands in that region, and we're finding thousands of high quality old growth grasslands as tiny remnants scattered throughout this region. So that yellow area is meant to say grassland. Blue, probably prairie. There aren't many of those in this region, but that's the potential. So let's move on to the next section. We do find these remnants in specific places. We're going to move through these quickly. Old historic preservation sites, power line rights of way over unplowed soil, and then avoided and forgotten places like that remnant savanna on the right in Fluvanna County. Next slide. We also find these things just over really crappy, agriculturally crappy soils, like on the left with all that liatris. You just can't plow it, so it never was. We find remnant wet savannas along old roads, and sometimes we find just massive fields that still have a high quality old growth grassland in them. Next slide. All right, so we reviewed those first little three items there in light gray. Place names are critical for indirect evidence for relocating or hypothesizing where grasslands once were. There are thousands of these names around the region. We've started mapping those. I've listed a few there: Buffalo Creek, Central Plains. Indigenous people definitely maintained open space, not only for agricultural use, but to just keep the space for the agriculture that will happen, say, in 15 years in a crop rotational practice. They definitely managed for mass production in uplands as well. And then there's all these quotes that are out there of the early explorers that actually point to savannas and other grassland types. Next slide. So, yeah. They're absolutely critical. A lot of the decline we have in the Piedmont is due to the loss of grasslands, it turns out. Oh, the monarch, the Bob White, rusty patch bumblebee. A lot of things are very dependent upon these open spaces. So let's go ahead and move on to the next slide. You guys can revisit that recap in the after and keep on track here. So we're moving on to the actual restoration portion of this and our methodology. I'll just go ahead and say that you have to get to know your local ecology, or you're going to have a hard time figuring out how to make plans for restoration. And this is kind of the missing gap in the conservation community. There's a lot of general theory that's thrown around the states. So you've got to get outside. You have to learn your local ecology. Place-based knowledge is critical. There are a few links or a few suggestions down there. Learn your natural communities at a DCR website that's provided at the end. Certainly get to know Southeastern Grasslands Initiative. They've got lots of resources. And of course, you can follow us. We kind of do a day-to-day thing that keeps up with it. Next slide. So diving into the methodology, we use this thing we call natural plant community modeling, and it's, on the face of it, it's real simple. You assess your site, number one. You go find a reference community with similar attributes as your restoration site. You document things there. You put the thing in, and then you manage it long term, and you're done. That's the basics of the methodology. So let's move on to step one and get into a couple of the details. And I will say again, this is definitely, this section right here was a 2-day class last summer. So I'm sorry, there may be new things in here for some of you, but I've got to breeze through them, and the introduction will allow you different avenues that you can pursue after this summit. So step one is to assess the site. As project manager, my wife Rachel right there, she goes through, she's looking for indicator species of native plants that might suggest the natural trajectory, because there's always native plants in the weeds that are not native, and they kind of suggest where things are headed. But these are key data points that we always collect first, because we take these to the next slide. We take these data points and many more out into the wild, and we find a landscape that matches those data points that also has an intact natural plant community. When we go there, we document critical data points, such as the number of species. We like to calculate diversity, but we also pay close attention to stratification, the composition. And then the next slide, we take all of that back and we create a design at the restoration site based on that reference site. and we plant that thing. And I think there are a number of ways that we do this that allow for it to be success. But perhaps the most important thing is patience. It takes about 3 years to pull this off. And then there's long-term management, but we don't skimp on the density. I mean 20 to 30 plants a square foot. We do that. 5th item down, 4th item down, you see pulse seeding. We mulch with seeds at multiple periods during a 3-year installation. And we definitely do some shepherding, which means we make room for the things that volunteer that are native. We don't pull them out. So there's a lot of learning along the way. We go into these things every time with the assumption that we are completely ignorant and learning new things, and so we can. We do assessments along the way. Step 4. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide. Those assessments allow for us to identify problems and make shifts along the way. Our path to the goal is never the same with any given project. We've done over 100 of these of various scales, from 1/4 acre to 15 acres. So the long-term management of these things, disturbance actually ends up being a very critical part, and I mean service disturbance, not soil disturbance. The fire picture on the left there is us burning a pine oak savanna this spring, and it results in the image on the right in a wet prairie. Those are it's an extremely diverse native assemblage with rare plants in it and everything. So education is a critical part as well. Let's move on to the next one. So the key points, I'm going to let you revisit these. I'll highlight number 2, environmental restoration and social justice. They are not separable. So there are opportunities in all your buffer restorations to bring this to the table, to bring it to bear, to come to terms with the inequities that are here in our culture and in the greenwashing of the environmental movement. So you guys, I think we all bear some responsibility to bring repair to that. So the last slide that I have in here, if it's still there, I think we kept it in, has resources with links. And I know you can't link directly from this, but these are primary resources I suggest you pursue. And with that, I know we're getting close to being out of time, so let's stop there. I'm going to take some questions. Back to you, Christine.
Great, thanks, Devin. You nailed that timing on it. A lot of great information. Thank you so much. There's a question in the chat roll, and I'm going to invite others to put your questions in the chat roll or share them in a few moments from Amber. Visits to these various riparian ecosystems would be great. How do you find reference communities? Do you have examples of them that are accessible?
Reference communities take a trained eye to find. You have to be able to see, when you get good at them, you can see them on a drive-by. They are dense assemblages of native plants that usually don't have exotic species associated with them, and it's pretty remarkable. So good places to see one, let me just send you directly to Pretty Creek Park Preserve in northern Albemarle County. Go ahead and go into the meadow out there beside the parking lot. We don't know why that is there. We don't understand the history of it, but it's clear that it's probably a high quality middle-aged grassland, maybe between 500 and 1,000 years old. So it's a great place to go see one and to learn about what to look for. Right now,
what's the name of that one again? What was the name?
Pretty Creek Park Preserve, northern Albemarle County. It's a public park. Easy parking and a short walk.
PREEDDY. We can put it in the chat roll. It's a great place to mountain bike too, in case people are interested.
That's a real good question. I wish I could illuminate more on that. There are ways to spot these things. There are several thousand per each county.
Thanks, Devin.
Some of them are as small as a room.
Great. So a couple other questions in the chat roll. Was there more than that, or do you mind if I keep going with the new questions? All right, I'm going to keep going. So as Emily mentioned in the chat roll, we will be sharing presenters' slides. So the links will come through in what we share after the fact. So we'll be sharing those links. Ryan has asked, how do you deal with resistance to prescribed burns and buffers?
Education. Prescribed burns are mostly rooted in Fear. So if we can educate people about what these fires actually look like and the care that is taken into planning for them and executing them, in my experience, all fears drop. And I've got nearly a 100% success rate, even in HOAs. There's a couple places where we burn right up to the back door. We actually burn away from the back door into the wind. But that is the key, education, and there are resources available online to help with that. I recommend the Department of Forestry.
Great, thanks, Devin. Another question here, and I'm going to stop sharing the screen so we can see each other in a minute. If you want me to go back to a specific slide, though, Devin, I can easily. Anne Marie asks, something to this effect that, can you make the assumption that if fescue is removed and trees are not naturally regenerating in that area, would the area, become a grassland and not a forest on its own?
On its own, if you mean with normal and natural long-standing human behavior, if it's colonialist behavior, yeah. So go ahead, Christine. Can you clarify?
I was going to ask if Anne Marie, do you want to add any more details to that good question? Any more rounding it out that you want to add?
I can try. I just hear it a lot that Virginia wants to go back to a forest. So I was just trying to understand that if they're not regenerating, that maybe it's trying to go back to a grassland.
Okay, I can answer that question. Virginia's landscapes are trying to do what they have the potential to do, and it turns out in our area, diversity is key. We're both forests and grasslands, and that is very well documented, okay? So the landscape would naturally go back to a closed canopy forest if natural disturbance was removed from the landscape. You would have savanna trees growing unnaturally as upper canopy trees, like post oak, for example, a fire-tolerant tree. Shortleaf pine is another example. That tree lingers in old forests, but it's actually a grassland tree, a savanna and woodland tree. And I will say that all those trees you guys love in the forest, they are in every single savanna or prairie remnant that we find growing as a shrub. So they still have their host plant benefit in the prairie. In fact, they produce more mast in a savanna setting.
Okay, great. Thanks, Devin. So we're going to have one more question, and then I'm going to officially recognize it's time. We're actually in our lunchtime now, so we will start right on time at 12:50. So if folks need to roll now, let's give Devin a thanks first. So Devin, big thanks. There's some really good questions and info in the chat roll. So I want to give snaps and claps to Devin, first of all. And Devin, can you stay on just for a couple more minutes for a couple more questions? Is that okay with you?
That's fine with me, and I did see some questions pop up that I'd be happy to answer after this session if somebody wants to get in touch with me.
I'm gonna go ahead and pose one or two of those now, and then we'll officially stop in about 2 minutes for lunch. So I'm gonna toss two of them out at once. The first one's from Alex. In the Piedmont, where there is a granitic-based geology with acidic soils and currently regenerating oak hickory forest, if fire was introduced at the appropriate intervals, would those forest communities transition to oak, hickory, woodlands, or savanna? And then second question, Dave asks, what cost per acre do projects run? Are there ways to integrate herbaceous elements usefully into buffer plantings, or cost per acre? So Devin, let me know if you need me to recap those. They're both in the chat roll.
Alex, yes is the short answer. Time is the question. It's not a matter of if, but when. If you introduce fire at the 3 to 7 year interval, you're going to get a savanna or a woodland on acidic substrates. If they are less than 3% slope, you're going to have massive openings that verge on being prairie. If you're greater than 15% slope, you're going to get woodlands on those slopes. The second question, the cost of the projects are vary significantly based on size and whether or not we're using plugs, seeds, or a combination. So I will say that we are right in the pocket with the industry standard, which is $5 to $7 a square foot for things under a couple thousand square feet. If you get extremely large restorations, they can span across a 3-year restoration period, and you're just using seed and fire. those costs could be in the 8 to 12,000 range. There's definitely opportunities for maturing that fee schedule within the context of a buffer restoration, and the unique challenges there, like the fescue that was mentioned earlier. That's a costly thing if it's not hit right. So yeah, I hope that gives you a little bit to run with there.
Great, thanks. So Matt has also put an interesting point in about, removing key dynamic elements of the system like fire and beaver, and what does original mean in that context. So we are going to leave the chat roll, or excuse me, the Zoom meeting open during lunch. So if folks want to continue questions with each other, I'm not sure if Devin's hanging or not, but what a rich potential for conversation we have here. So people are welcome to stay on the Zoom meeting and chat, eat your lunch, hang out. We will start again at 12:50. So again, let's everyone thank Devin. Really awesome presentation across the board. You really hit the nail on the head, Devin. I appreciate it. It does sound great though, so thank you. So welcome everybody back. Hope you had a great lunch. Welcome if you're just joining for the first time. It's delightful to see you. Hey, Christopher. Welcome others. So we had a stellar day so far of learning. So if you are just finding your way back, if this is your first time here, welcome. Feel free to put your name and affiliation in the chat roll if you haven't done that yet. For our panelists and our speakers, Amber is going to be introducing you as well. But we've had a rich conversation both with our panelists in our breakout rooms and with the presenters and discussion so far today. So super thanks to everyone for joining us so far. We are rolling into, we've heard so much excitement about our afternoon session today. So we're really looking forward to hearing from Jim and hearing from Christopher and Shay and Amber this afternoon. So we're really looking forward. So where we're headed now is Amber is going to introduce Jim to talk about the DCR perspective, and really about celebrating riparian restoration through the soil and water conservation districts and the VACS program. And then we'll have in about 15 minutes, our third panel, Reimagining the Conservation Workforce, Restoring Communities and Water Quality. I want to again really thank all of our panelists for staying on time today. Y'all have been awesome at making my job easy. So thank you, and welcome back everyone for lunch. Again, it's fine if your kids are with you, food, drinks, take care of your needs, all that good stuff. I'm going to pull the slides up and turn it over to you, Amber, to introduce Jim.
Thanks, Christine. So Jim Eccles is next. Quick little bio on Jim. He is the Western Area Manager at Virginia Department of Conservation and Recreation's Division of Soil and Water Conservation. He supervises 3 offices covering the western half of Virginia. And the work of these offices is to implement these programs to improve water quality. So Jim, over to you.
Great, thank you very much. All right, let's have the next slide, please, because we know what this meeting is.
And Jim, you likely know there's a few second delay from when you say next to when it comes up, but it will show up.
Right, okay. All right, most of you all already know, some of you may not. We do our work largely through soil and water conservation districts, although not entirely. And a big part of what we do is we help fund the Virginia Agricultural Cost Share Program. I'm going to refer to that as VACS from this point on. We produce a manual every year, and right now we have somewhere over 70 different cost share practices. So these practices are delivered by the local soil and water conservation districts. There are 47 in the Commonwealth of Virginia. All of these practices focus on water quality. Could I have the next slide, please? Every year we work to update the VACS manual. What we want to do is be current, address current problems, etc. About 4 years ago, we made a huge effort to accelerate the Chesapeake Bay cleanup. So we expanded the TAC to about 70 members. The TAC meets every year, and typically the TAC includes districts, conservation groups, industry groups, state agencies, etc. We ended up asking people for input on what we could do to help accelerate the implementation of the Ag Cost Share Program. People were not shy. We had well over 200 suggestions the first year. We're in the 4th year of this now. We've shrunk it down to 4 committees instead of 5, and we're down to about 30 people. But every year we try to do this to help make sure we do everything we can to make the practices more attractive to individuals to be participating in the cost share program. Next slide, please. One of the things we did very recently is we took one of our common practices, which is stream exclusion with grazing land management, we commonly refer to as SL6, and we split it into a SL6N for narrow and an SL6W for wide. For narrow, the buffers are less than 35 feet. For wide, they're over 35 feet. The buffer option comes with the payment with the wide buffers. So if you're putting in a wide buffer, we pay people for the buffer. And the bigger the buffer, the more we pay. As an agency, we really like big buffers, so we try to do a lot to help make this a more attractive program to landowners. Next slide, please. When this comes up, what it'll do is it'll show you, here we go, the different amount we pay depending on what you set up to do with the wide buffers. So you can see we have 15 and 10-year programs. We decided to not go longer than 15 because it's hard to persuade people to tie up their land in a program that long because it has to be inspected, and if they don't keep the program active, keep the whatever the practice is active, they have to reimburse the district on a prorated base. So you can see we'll pay up to 100% of the cost share. So each district has different set rates they'll pay for our allowable practices. And then we'll pay on top of that $80 per acre per year. So this provides a whole lot of money for people to be maintaining their buffers as well. So this is a good example of the kind of changes we made recently when we asked the districts and others for what their input was on how to accelerate the cleanup of Chesapeake Bay. Next slide, please. The SL6 standard practice, which was the old one, the number of practices in the upper James as of early January was about 1,900, protecting a little over 5 million linear feet of streams. We just started this new practice a couple years ago, July 1, 2019. And keep in mind, it may take several years for somebody to install one of these practices. We haven't seen a whole lot of SL6 narrow in the upper and middle James, but we've seen a fair amount of the wide. And particularly important is with the wide, we're seeing an increase in the average buffer width. It's gone up to 72 feet, average of the 28 that I was checking on back in January, or pardon me, in September. So that's a really big increase in buffer width. That's something I think we all agree is very desirable. Next page, please. Okay, forest buffers. We have a couple forest practices, but the woodland forest filter area, what we refer to as FR3, is designed for planting trees in the riparian buffer. We worked to increase the amount of money involved in this. Patti Nylander, one of our previous speakers, was in the technical advisory committee that put this together. And what we pay now is 95% of the eligible cost plus a bonus for the planting. So the conifers, $10 per acre for 10 years, $150 for 15, and hardwoods, it goes up higher for the longer lifespan. So the increase to a 95% was a significant increase from previous years. Next slide, please. FR3 from 1998 until this year, we only had 33 in the upper and middle James. Since July 1 of 2019, we've already had 5. So perhaps this is really causing some excitement in the community. And it was a small number of districts that did it. But I find it really exciting to see this kind of growth in buffers in the FR3, the forest buffer practice. Next slide, please. All right, we have, well over a dozen different practices for stream exclusion. Something else that's used a lot is Conservation Reserve Enhancement, or CREP. That's partnered with, a whole list of state agencies, the federal agencies, local districts. So you can see there the list of people that get involved in it. Makes it more complicated, but it also can be very attractive to property owners. Next slide, please. There are two main CREP buffer practices, the grass buffer and the riparian forest buffer. Next slide, please. Okay, you can see how many we've had. The majority of them have been forest. Now, I'm not sure if these are counted through our cost share or through federal, so I don't know exactly how this is reported for the Chesapeake Bay program. But we have pretty good number of acres in the forest buffer program here just in the upper and middle James. Next slide, please. Let's talk a little bit about what's coming down the pike. There was a Bay bill this year. It's commonly referred to as the Bay bill, and it said a number of things. First of all, we require exclusion of cattle of more than 20 head for anybody that had cattle in the Chesapeake Bay watershed if we do not meet our Chesapeake Bay goals in 2025. I'll talk about that. We were also tasked with identifying perennial streams without field verification, so without setting foot on the property. Oh gosh, that's an impossible task. And it directs us to develop a portable stream fencing. I don't know why the General Assembly chose the word portable, but that's what they said. Call for a couple other things we're not going to talk about. Nutrient management on all cropland in the Bay of over 50 acres and forming a stakeholder advisory group. We won't talk about those. We will talk quickly about the other three. Next slide, please. All right, these things are over the horizon, so they're still being developed. We have a small herd initiative we're looking at developing. And that will focus on small herds of, say, 20 to 35 head. One of the challenges is to make sure that the landowners are not splitting their herds. So a property owner has a lot of animals, is splitting it into multiple herds to try to qualify. Our concept at this point is we pay 100% of the stream exclusion cost up to a maximum of $25,000. We hope to start with a pot of $1 million for the incentive, plus then 13% for technical assistance. This will probably be on a first come, first served basis. Would not impact the person's other ag cost share cap. The State Soil and Water Conservation Board will have to approve this. This is not something we can simply do by ourselves. Next slide, please. You may have heard about a study in Rockingham County to try to identify stream fencing in Rockingham County. It was done with remote sensing. We'll probably use a tool sort of like this to develop the perennial stream identification tool. So what we did was we looked at aerial photos from multiple years, and you can see some of the different databases we used. The good news, what we found is there's a significant increase in the amount of stream fencing. We looked to see if we could identify streams with a 35-foot buffer, and we went from about 24% in 2002 to 41% in 2018. Now, stream identification without setting foot on it, it's kind of like sending children to school with COVID. No matter what you do is wrong. I'm sure there will be cases where we will identify streams as being perennial, and lo and behold, there may not even be a stream there. And other times there'll be nice big streams that won't be caught by this. No matter what we do is wrong. It's kind of like looking at USGS maps. Those blue line streams aren't necessarily really streams. Next slide, please. All right, portable fencing. This is also under development. The intent is to provide flexible fencing systems to prevent stream bank erosion, direct deposit animal waste, other contamination. So it's to provide an incentive. I think it was Bill earlier today was talking about wanting more choices on what a farmer could do. This is a new choice. We already have, I think it's 17 different choices as it is. Next slide, please. With the portable fencing, there is no minimum standard for the fencing as it is right now. This is evolving. The TAC is working on it, and it has to go through the state board. Our concept at this point is that the producer will be responsible to provide the water for the livestock. And of course, they would have to maintain the fencing during the entire length of the cost share period for the program. All right, I think I had what, 10 minutes? Am I close to that?
You were right on. Great job with your timing. That was awesome. So Jim's contact information is up on the slide now. Jim, we have time just for one question. There have been two, but one of them has been answered by our brand new tool. So it's so cool, Brianna, that you asked a question that was then answered by the tool. So for those of you who may not have heard Amber's slides earlier, there's a brand new tool that's been launched. So check out the chat roll for that. If you have any questions, let us know. Emily, would you mind putting your text or your cell phone number in again for people who might have IT or troubleshooting questions? Contact Emily. Jim, Kim is asking, can anyone answer if the Bay Bill would apply to all the counties in the Chesapeake Bay watershed or just the regulated Tidewater counties?
No, it's Bay-wide.
Okay.
Gee, I answered a question. Better write that down. One more slide. Just want to remind everybody the high points of what I was talking about. So if you go to the next one, please. Okay, next is updated every year. That's our cost share program. We're putting a tremendous effort into accelerating the implementation, to help clean up the bay. And a number of items are under development: the small herd initiative, identifying perennial streams, and portable fencing. Never ceases to amaze me how much is going on in this tiny little division of this state agency. And with the question from Brianna Haymore, hi Brianna, it's good to hear from you.
Brianna had actually asked a question that was also answered to some degree in the chat roll. As a private company in the industry, how can we best share the information on cost share programs that are offered? And Amber had mentioned the new program that was developed today that Emily put a link in the chat roll to. Anything else on that, Jim, on Brianna's question?
Sure, I'd be happy to meet with Brianna and share with her any information we have or anybody else. If you go to the DCR webpage and look at the ag incentives, you will be able to find our cost share manual. It lays out all the gazillion different programs we have. It talks about what the cost share rates are. Also, districts are the best local source because districts set their own local based prices. They can tell you about contractors, what's working, what isn't working. There are a lot of other agencies or groups out there that are doing a lot of good work as well. So shop around. I know Chesapeake Bay Foundation's done a lot. Trout Unlimited's doing some things. So there are a lot of things. It's not a one-size-fits-all world.
Great. Thanks, Jim. Really super helpful information as we are kind of looking at both ends from different agencies about what's happening across restoration efforts, tools, and what's on the horizon across the watershed. So let's thank Jim with, again, your reactions, snaps, claps, round of applause. Thank you, Jim. Really appreciate it. So we're going to transition now to our third and final and panel of the day that we're really excited about: reimagining the conservation workforce, restoring communities, and water quality. So Amber, I'll turn it over to you to introduce our panelists.
All right, thanks, Christine. I left a question for you then there in the chat, Jim, for later. All right, so our last panel, panel number 3, reimagining the conservation workforce, restoring communities and water quality. And we have 2 guests here, Christopher Rashad Green. Let me read his real quick. Christopher is a community advocate and activist, a motivational speaker, and the founder of Freedom Unlimited, a reentry initiative. He is a formerly incarcerated individual who now, as a political organizer and health equity advocate, is on a journey to empower men, women, and children in overcoming the challenges and injustices of the criminal justice system. He is the lead organizer at New Virginia Majority, where he leads their criminal justice campaigns. And we also have Shay Zwerver. She is a policy specialist with the Pennsylvania Department of Conservation and Natural Resources. Shay created a pilot program that trains inmates nearing release at state correctional institutions and natural resources. This endeavor required coordinating the PA Department of Corrections and leveraging expertise of other organizations needed to teach the subject matter. So, and I'm going to start off a little bit. James mentioned this earlier. You can go to the next slide. It'll fill in. But yeah, so just starting this conversation off, restoration is a word we use all the time. And if you want to enter things in the chat box, feel free. But just thinking, what kind of things come to your mind when you think of that word restoration and restore? It's a heavy word. It's a word that has a lot of power behind it, I think. And the longer I do this work, the more I see how being a part of restoring our water and our land also restores those in the communities around it. And we all know we have a huge buffer goal to reach. And at the same time, there's a lot of folks that are out of jobs. And so I invite you all to imagine a world where we could look at restoring both of those things together. They don't have to be separate. And I think this group particularly has an opportunity to do it right and really to take a holistic approach to this work. So that's my little soapbox for a minute. And so what's cool right now is that we have an opportunity to think about how to do this. We have two Department of Corrections facilities in the James River watershed that are seeing attention right now. So the Augusta Correctional Center just received a NIFWIF grant to exclude their cattle and do buffer work. And the State Farm Project in Goochland and Powhatan is also has a lot of efforts going on there right now, thanks to this NIFWIF grant, as well as funding through VEE and the Nature Conservancy, as well as the State Lands Fund through Department of Forestry. So we're working on these projects. You can see the metrics over there to the side, but there's also this interest from Department of Corrections and the state to really think about training and workforce development as part of this. And so Virginia Cooperative Extension is leading the way on developing trainings, both around building fencing as well as riparian forest buffers. And I love when things overlap. What's cool is we're going to be able to use those trainings that Alliance for the Chesapeake Bay and the Chesapeake Bay Landscape Professional Program are developing for the consortium. We're going to be able to utilize that here at State Farm for those inmates and for the staff. And so we are really trying to do it right, I guess. And so Shay's program you're going to hear about is one that we are keeping our eyes on and seeing how we could replicate it here in Virginia. And so, so we're excited to first introduce Christopher, who's going to take us on a journey and give real insight to what can make a successful program that both takes the inmates' interest in consideration to ensure that these programs not only get work on the ground, but gives these folks experience, knowledge, and something they can take with them when they get out. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Christopher. And you can go to the next slide.
Thank you, Amber.
Yeah.
Again, my name is Christopher Rashad Green. It's so appropriate that she says restoration. I'm actually pictured with my certificate of restoration of my voting rights, or also known as civil rights. And this was in 2016. So this is near the end of the journey that I've been on, this 10-year journey to help restore the rights of those in our communities and restore families together. And as based on that, I am a formerly incarcerated individual. I have been incarcerated over 15 years, over a 40-year period in 5 different states. I was actually a resident of State Farm for briefly here in Virginia. I'm originally from New Jersey. And so I've been on this odyssey of re-entry and trying to get a successful re-entry perspective for individuals. And being that I guess I'm qualified to speak on that because I took every vocational trade within the systems in the 5 states I've been in. Next slide. And even though my journey started in what we know now known as a school to prison pipeline, over 40 years ago. This is one of my earlier pictures of incarceration as a young adult. Don't be fooled by the smile. I was a little aloof and a little lacking of direction, trying to assure my parents that I was doing okay inside. But this was over 20 years ago inside. Notice the pretty flowers behind. I found it so ironic that in a place of such misery, they had such beauty inside. Next slide. So over a 40-year period, 15 years in and out of incarceration, addressing all, subject to all type of social determinants, homelessness, drug addiction. So at the end of my journey in the prison industrial complex, this is 2013. I'm not smiling anymore, but I can say I was so focused because it was at this point, as I said, I took many vocational trades from data entry to print shop to welding. But I found that my last time inside, I got involved with horticultural class, and it opened my eyes to some amazing possibilities of what I could do on the outside, being connected to the earth and watching things grow. I was fascinated by it. Next slide. So upon my release in 2013, it was basically 7 years ago, when I re-entered back into, to the community, I had a passion for food justice and community and urban gardening. So I became part of what is known as the Richmond Food Justice Alliance here in Richmond, which was addressing food deserts, the creation of food deserts, how to eliminate them, and how to make community members more engaged and bring them involved in this process. I really had a vision of opening up a garden, a food market, a food stand. It was like a 2-year period where I was involved with this initiative. Next slide. And I was only been out 3 years, and I learned about aquaponic and hydroponic gardening. I learned about soil compositions, and basically we were using as a tool of community engagement for our communities to bring them in. And it's still a process of that going on in Richmond. But this is something I had a passion for. Next slide. And with that passion, I thought that, this type of tool, this is behind one of my residences in Richmond. It's ironic that I happen to live right behind a community garden here in Richmond for a while. So I would go there to contemplate and just relax right at the community garden, right behind my house. And so that's why I am part of this conversation, because in restoring our communities and also restoring our environment, we have to restore the individuals inside. And I think I have a great perspective on how individuals feel inside, and we'll get into that later on in the lecture. But this is, next slide. Food justice is something that I'm really passionate about, and eradicating food deserts in our communities. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Amber. Thank you, Amber.
Yep, and we'll be back to Christopher in a minute. We're going to hear from Shay now about what they're working on in Pennsylvania.
Hey. Hi, I'm going to share with you a case study on, as Amber mentioned, a vocational training in natural resource conservation for inmates nearing release at Pennsylvania State Correctional Institutions. We began in 2017, so it's been going on for about 3 years now. Next slide. Great, so I'd like to provide some context first before we get into the program. This shouldn't be news to any of you, but there's a lot of people under some form of correctional jurisdiction in the United States. So in 2016, there were about 6.6 million in total, which was about 2% of the population. As of August 2020, there were about 26,000 incarcerated at Virginia State Correctional Facilities. In Pennsylvania, their Department of Corrections, they categorize 82% of their inmate population as having no skills or being unskilled. So ultimately, it's a large population of people that are prime, for skill building. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to break down kind of the cost of incarceration. In 2018, the average operating cost per inmate in Virginia was $87.20 a day, which equates about $32,000 a year. Virginia does have one of the lowest recidivism rates in the country. And recidivism is just when a convicted individual reoffends. So they're going back into, you know, a state or some other, or facility, or just back under the correctional jurisdiction. In Pennsylvania, to give you a sense, the 3-year recidivism rate in Pennsylvania is about 60%. I like to provide these numbers to get people thinking about just how much is being spent, and also we'd hope that, you know, that money is being spent in ways that facilitate rehabilitation, but that's not always the case. Next slide, please. So research by RAND Corporation, they found inmates who participate in correctional education programs had a 43% lower odds of recidivating and 28% higher odds of finding post-release employment. I like to couple that information on the left with the graph on the right, which shows, it's from Rikers Island, New York, the facility Rikers Island there. And it's a study that found inmates who participated in the Green Prison Program, that they call it, which is just a horticultural focused one. Those individuals had much lower rates of recidivism compared to the general Rikers Island population of reentrants, or the New York State at large reentrant population. And then a few slides later, I'll share some research that supports my hypothesis of why this might be. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is I had put in another slide to give you just a better idea. It's very blurry, so you won't be able to read the numbers, but those are just statistics from the Bureau of Labor statistics that show, you know, the job outlook, specifically in kind of the landscaping green industry. There are no titles or kind of overarching umbrellas specifically for riparian forest buffer, you know, installers or maintainers. It usually falls within the landscaping and groundskeeping workers. Next slide, please. So we're gonna do a poll for all of you. I'd like to hear from you whether you own a business that does riparian forest buffer installation or maintenance, or you're an organization that contracts out this work, but I'd like you to share about just the need that you're experiencing in this field. So I think if you click on the screen, there's a link to the poll, which just asks one question.
Thanks, Shay. And for people, if it might not be showing up on your screen, sometimes it might go behind your browser window. So you might need to hit escape for it to show up. I see that 18% of people have filled it up, so I know it's live. So again, if you can't find it, just play around and you should be able to find it. If you're joining by phone and you're not able to share your feedback, we can take your feedback just, you know, by you saying it as well. So just let us know if anybody needs for us to read the questions out loud to you. Any technical problems or questions from anybody on the poll? We'll have just about, go ahead.
I can insert the link to the poll if that helps in the chat box.
Anybody not able to access it? Emily can pop it in the chat. Well, no, okay, we just have this Zoom poll, but we'll give you about 20 seconds of silence just to be able to read it. All right, 63% of folks have voted, which is great. Another 5 seconds or so, and then we'll close it and share the results. All right, so I'm ending the poll and we'll share the results. And Shay, would you like to share what the results are of the poll? Can you see that?
Sure. It says 58% said that, oh, and I'll just mention the question. It says, do you have a need or demand for more contractors who can install and maintain riparian forest buffers? Yes, I notice a major need for contractors to do this work. 58% responded to yes. I don't know, it's 29%. And then no, I have not noticed or experienced a need or demand for more contractors to do this work, 13%. Thanks. That's helpful. At the end of the slide, there's another link I'll explain later. So next slide, please. All right, so the program started out as a workforce pipeline for the tree care industry, because the tree care industry, I was working in urban forestry and they're experiencing a demand for workers. So in the text box on the right, you can see that the tree care industry identified at a workforce summit the different challenges that they're facing. And that workforce summit was in May of 2018. So meanwhile, my colleagues in the riparian forest buffer space were seeing a similar demand now and into the future. As you know, it lists all of our WIP goals and how many acres we have to plant in 5 short years. So my colleagues, Teddy Stark, who runs the riparian forest buffer in Pennsylvania at DCNR, and then Ryan Davis with the Alliance for Chesapeake Bay reached out to me, and we conceived the riparian forest buffer vocational training to pilot at a state correctional institution. Next slide, please. All right, so this slide just shows kind of, there's the 3 major buckets of organizations that are involved. So we started calling it the Correctional Conservation Collaborative, or CCC, which is kind of a tribute to Roosevelt's Civilian Conservation Corps. But this gives you an idea of the collaboration it takes, but also how the program addresses the different needs of the various entities involved. So for example, in the one bucket, the Department of Corrections, this program helps with reducing recidivism. In Pennsylvania, DCNR, we have the need to build a workforce pipeline and build capacity to maintain and install riparian forest buffers. So this program helps with that. So kind of the outside text, this text outside of those circle or boxes just, speaks to the different solutions such a program can provide. Next slide, please. All these bullets are objectives of the program. I won't read through all of them, but I'll highlight a few as we go. And, as I present to the different agencies and entities involved to garner, or solicit more volunteers, then those are some of the objectives we're able to talk on. But I will highlight, that's okay, you can go to the next slide. I will highlight one of my favorite objectives, this is a study, and I've just pulled out some of the findings, but I want to highlight this objective is one I think that can be easily overlooked, especially those that are helping to coordinate such projects. So it's important to keep in mind the mental health benefits of being in nature. So this was a study that specifically looked at exposure to nature for inmates, reduces aggressive behavior. They had lower rates of inmates going to the infirmary. So it really provides a lot of, and we all on this call probably are aware of that, of just like how restorative it can be to be in nature. Next slide, please. I just wanted to break up our slideshow with a short little clip. I think it's about, 30 seconds. So this is on our installation day, an inmate being interviewed who participated in the vocational training we had. Hopefully it'll
give me a quick second to pull it up, and it will be here in just a second.
Believe that,
Can you
'cause
hear
it's my
it?
whole goal.
You could hear it? Okay, let me just get it going. Share full screen.
I could hear it the first time, but I can't hear it this time.
Let me try it one more time. Hopefully it'll work. Can you hear it?
That's okay. I have good images throughout the.
To the same thing, getting in trouble, and this is perfect. This is perfect. So hopefully, within my first 2 months of being home, I get a job in this field. I can make a career out of it. That's awesome. You know? I'm like, I never thought a day in my life I'd be in a state correctional institution learning about trees. Like I never thought. And now I'm glad I did it. And I'm gonna take the next program too. I think it's called like Seedlings or something like that. I'm taking every program I can get. The more certificates, the better.
Thanks.
Back
I think if you want to Google too, I think SCI, Huntington, Riparian Forest Buffer Vocational Training, usually a lot of the media clips that they've done will show up. Yeah, that was Thomas, one of the inmates who participated in the program. So it ran from July to October of 2019. It was about 11 weeks in total, 88 hours. Teddy, Ryan, and I all live in South Central Pennsylvania, and we all wanted to try to be there for every class. So we would drive up to Huntington, which is about 2.5 hours north of us, every time we had a class. So we usually had a class like 2 to 3 times a week. We had field work, prepping site at Huntington SCI, and maintaining some Mifflin County CREP buffers as well. Next slide. Each bullet just represents the different topic that we touched on. So Teddy, Ryan, and I all sat down and talked about the topics that would be important to incorporate into the training. And it was really, helpful to have Teddy and Ryan's insight, since they're on the ground doing this all the time. And these were just the different topics. So essentially we recruited speakers for each of the different topics. It was important that we had a diversity of instructors too, and break up. So even though like Ryan, Teddy, and I might have been able to teach all of these topics, we wanted to get different perspectives, people from academic institutions, people working, in the field and private industry, and just breaking up to the different voices people hear. So next slide, please. These are the logos of the different partners who are involved, who helped teach a lot of the different topics. It was, very little can happen without partnerships. So just want to stress my gratitude towards all of them. Next slide, please. So state correctional institutions, we were surprised you have a lot of land still. The other facility that we do training at has 6,000 acres, 2,400 is wooded, like 700 is agriculture. They have a tree nursery. So Huntington is similar, where they have thousands of acres, and it just so happens that they have a little stream on their property that they do lease out to a farmer. So we took an aerial image, you can see, of the property, highlighted the stream, and we gave them options. It would have been too much, I think. And also piloting this, we're still building trust with the facility. So we just did, I think we did 2 acres this first year in 2019. So we highlighted and said, well, in future years, we could come back and do, priority area 2 or 3. So and then the images on the right, you'll see are kind of pictures, the before pictures I took of the stream that we buffered. Next slide, please. These are just some pictures from the different days. So we did maintenance days, a stream ecology day, spraying demo days, tree planting installation. You can kind of run through the different few slides, I think are just images. Next slide, please. Site maintenance day. This was at one of the Mifflin County CREP buffers. Okay. We also did a program evaluation. So I learned this in the second year, just how it would be important to kind of do a pre and post evaluation to see if they learned anything. So it was the same exam. We did about 50 questions, all multiple choice. We read it out loud, walked through it together. And you can see the blue represents the very first day is when we gave the pre-evaluation, and they all scored better. The orange bar graph showed their score the last day of the class, so they learned different terms and definitions. We also want to collect some qualitative data, so just asking them questions about it. So what were their expectations going into the class? So it was nice to get this feedback. I'll let you read some of those quotes, and the slides will be available so you can read at a later date. Next slide, please. What did you like most about the training was another question, and they answered that. So this slide just shows the different programs that we've done. We've just worked at 2 state correctional institutions so far, the Rock Views, it's ironically called the Forestry Camp, and then Huntington Mods. And then you can see all the programs. We've done the different seat hours. We're doing a program right now at the Forestry Camp, so that's another 12 inmates. So overall, we've reached about 160 individuals, and some of them are working in the industry, mostly the tree care industry, but riparian forest buffer, TBD. Next slide, please. All right, and I think this opens it back up to Chris, and we'll take questions at the end. If you guys have any questions about this, or my contact information will be at the end too, so feel free to reach out. But I think
yeah, and Christine, if you want to, Chris doesn't have any slides for this section, so you can choose to either keep up the slide or just turn it off for just his or faces if you want.
Thank you, Amber. Yes, that was a great point about Virginia's recidivism rate. But for me, as a formerly incarcerated person, and what I know now is like we're not where we're at as far as chain gangs and exploiting our prison labor. But that is for me, a personal goal with making sure that inmates aren't continually exploited for that workforce labor. I was seeing, I put in the chat about contractors, more contractors needed. Excuse me, about more contractors needed. And I always, basically it seems like it comes down to money a lot of times, always funding. But we can overcome even those challenges to develop a great workforce. But I think exploitation for me is making sure that, because individuals are vulnerable in those places, incarcerated individuals. But it's great that, even as inside, we use those periods as learning period, and trying to explore and grow as individuals. So we want to take advantage of that. And also, like I said, it was hearing those stories and those testimonies, it took me back, because it really opened up a whole new world for me. But one of the major challenges for reentry, and we're talking about creating a great reentry model to enhance, our communities. And one thing I need to share, I just want to put that in there, is that, we want to make sure our buffers and our forests are maintained, and so that, environment stays, where it's at. But also, I think urban gardening should be included in that also, since many individuals come from urban areas. Majority in Virginia, majority of folks are released to major areas like Norfolk, Richmond, parts of Northern Virginia. So I think urban gardening and exposing these individuals to all aspects of agriculture and gardening, as well as forestry, would be a great add-on. But for me personally, like, I'm a perpetual recidivist. Like I said, I've been in and out over a 40-year period. And so it was always due to a lack of that continuity upon release. You have these high expectations, but there's nothing in place for you. It can be kind of frustrating. And so transitioning from inside to out, and I've always said this, I've said this many years, that the private sector and the public sector need to really come together and make this happen. If we're addressing really mass incarceration, pre-trial detention, as Shay said, we have over, at one point, I think we have 28,000 to 29,000 folks inside. That's not including the jails. That's a whole nother story. But transitioning out, just for me personally, there's a need for more support in those fields, because like I said, they come from urban areas. And I think it's incumbent upon us here at this class to really look at how we can construct a real, efficient reentry model without exploiting. Like I said, I keep saying it, but we don't want to exploit the labor. Just based on my history as an African-American in this country. Inside, when you're inside, all those options are great. You're learning to build self-esteem, As stated by the slide, she said that, you know, how many percentages of folks who do succeed upon taking a horticulture class. It's not only about learning a skill, but it's like it builds that person personally. It restores them to where they have a vision and a purpose. And so when I came out, as I said, I actually was a board member for a food collaborative here in Richmond, Cornerstone Farms, and along with the Richmond Food Justice Alliance. But my passion for that couldn't sustain me. It just, because I needed to eat, I needed to work, I needed to, you know, in my reentry process, we have to work, we have to maintain. And so my passion for food justice and agriculture, urban gardening couldn't sustain me on a personal level. And so my path turned to criminal justice issues. But living wages is, you know, we already know how living wages are needed. Even in my arena, you know, we just had the minimum wage increase to $15 an hour here in the state. And so at some point we'll have some close to living wage for individuals. But as the big barrier, if we want to maintain a viable workforce, there has to be some type of compensation. And we don't want to use money as an incentive. You know, passion is great. We want individuals to come in and want to learn and empower themselves. But even though you want to follow your passion, you don't want to chase money, but it's a fact of life. So our end goal really, you know, when we're talking about empowering folks, empowering those folks, and so that in the aggregate, everybody benefits. You know, so looking at creating a vision of success for this type of venture we're talking about, our buffers. I didn't know anything. I met Amber, you know, first time I heard about a Watershed, it was several years ago. You know, I learned about Watershed, so I delved into that, learning about buffer systems and about our environment. You know, I've never been a big, passionate one of environmental change, environmental issues, even though as an organizer, I do address them. But this right here is a perfect setting for a great opportunity for us to create this vision, you know, and creating a viable workforce. And we talk about doing this, we have to reach out to stakeholders in our communities. They have to be brought to the table, as well as formerly incarcerated folks and their loved ones and all those individuals around criminal justice. They had to be brought to the table at some point if we really want to make this successful. But it looks like we're the ones who are going to move this forward in Virginia. Yes, like I said, I took HVAC, I've taken horticulture classes, I've taken data entry, had all certificates, but it wasn't able to sustain me. It didn't, you know, I wasn't successful. And I'm proud of the fact that I, you know, returned back and forth to prison over a 40-year period. It's nothing I'm proud of. But I got to the point now, 10 years ago, I see how important it is for individuals transitioning out. And that's why I formed this reentry initiative. And I would love to have this type of subject matter in our reentry classes to help folks, you know, explore those possibilities. So I look forward to working with everybody on this panel. If there's any questions anybody has of me, any clarity, you need any clarity about what I've said, I'm open to that. Put it in the chat box. I'll leave my contact information at the end of this session, but thank you again.
Great. Thanks so much, Christopher and Shay. Tremendous presentations and words. Lowry Tucker of Conservation Services has put a question/comment in the chat roll about, so their company hires between 7 to 60 contractors per season. And one of their greatest challenges is finding people who are, one, interested in the line of work, and two, get along with other strong personalities in a close working environment. Chris, any thoughts on that? That juxtaposition of situations?
Yeah, and that's true. I can understand that because individuals are traumatized by incarceration. These are some of the things that we don't really look at because most people prioritize like employment and housing as our priorities for folks coming home, what we call returning citizens. And that is true, that is a priority, but there's so many other things that folks go through in incarceration. And trauma is, I think, the number one thing. And so one of my goals is to explore that and make individuals aware of why they act like they do and how trauma can follow you from childhood all the way through adulthood and through incarceration. So that has to be somewhere in the equation where that has to be addressed. I know it's challenging, and that's why I think all community partners must come together on this. Because there is, I mean, the workforce is there. We have individuals who can actually do this. It's just the challenges that individuals face and our communities. And like you say, that cross collaboration. I've always had a vision of bringing folks to the table. As one of my visions as a young man, is bringing folks together to the table and work out all these differences from faith-based to politicians to community members. So to answer your question, I understand it can be challenging trying to onboard folks who have the passion, the interest, and the capability to follow this type of occupation in this field. But trauma, like I said, I have to say that it's not the whole entire picture. And, we see discrimination in the workplace and in hiring practices all the time, but we don't look at individuals. And there's a great organization in Richmond now that are actually plugging in to employers to look at this. William Weber, I'm trying to think of the name of the organization, but they actually work with formerly incarcerated folks, returning citizens, but their main goal is to get with employers and to make sure employers see these issues and support their workers. So I think that is a great part of supporting those individuals, not just utilizing their skill set and their passion. You have to support these individuals coming out because they are a vulnerable population of folks.
Yeah. Being aware of the trauma, being aware of the vulnerability, and also bringing people to the table. Yeah, great points. And Lowry says, an incredible idea. We want to see it be a success in Pennsylvania and Virginia. So I love that you're talking about bringing folks to the table. Laurel has put a question in the chat roll and has her hand raised. Way to find the rest of the tools, Laurel. So Laurel, I'm just going to turn it over to you to either, say your question, whether it's the one in the chat roll or another one as well. So Laurel.
So, Mr. Green, thank you for presenting today. And I had a question for you. You mentioned, sustainable wage, and this, I think it was in March. I work for Albemarle County, Virginia, and I looked into with our local jail what it would cost essentially to hire folks who are incarcerated to work on some of our stormwater management facilities where there's a lot of really non-glorious work that has to be done to keep them maintained. And the pandemic came, so I never followed through. They stopped their program. They have a litter pickup program on a lot of our roads as well. But as I looked at the piece of paper that I had written down notes on how much it would cost, which was not very much, I had sort of this moral dilemma of, are we doing the right thing to hire folks at this rate who are incarcerated, and they're paying off their fees, their court fees and such by working? And I wanted to just get your view on that.
You say you're hiring folks while they're still inside or when they come out?
Well, they're still inside.
Oh, yes, definitely. Big thing. And again, from my perspective and those of us inside, I'm speaking for those, I would like to think I'm speaking for those on the inside. The prison culture is 35 cents an hour. So when you come with possibly coming at minimum wage, you're rich in terms of institution. You're making a wage, even if it's only minimum wage. So we don't want to do that, of course. I see your dilemma. In our what we call our enterprise, Virginia enterprise system, who makes all these different furnitures and t-shirts and underwear. They compensate those individuals not much. They might make a couple $100 a month compared to making $40 a month, at inmate pay. And yeah, it's a dilemma to do that. So maybe establishing some type of where they can actually save it, invest it. There we go. We're bringing in more partners into this picture. But and most individuals who seek that wage while they're in there and these jobs and these work details is ultimately to save money for when they get out. But it's not a lot. I came out in 2013. I came out with $300 to my name, and I made that last for like 9 months. For 3 months, until I found work. So that's the challenges. I know individuals who make that money and get out and blow it in less than 6 months. They get out because they haven't addressed those personal issues. And so that is a challenge, yes. But in compensating those individuals, I think if you build them up by providing a savings account or something of that nature, something that builds skill building type venture to help them. We're going to compensate you, but you know, this is the but now. What can we do to compensate them? Can we pay for their training when they get out? Can we invest in them somehow when they do get out? You know, not just throw them a few dollars. Because I always say like 90% of folks that are in, you know, when they're making money, it's just for time just to get out. It's not really a passion of theirs. Not to defer from the presentation, because like I said, I was one of those individuals. But and to answer your question, yeah, that is a great dilemma, especially when our minimum wage is $15 an hour. It's going to be $15 an hour soon. But we want to give inmates, you know, hate to use the term slave wages, because they are wages. And it's great. It's a good compensation. I mean, you know, if you're paying them minimum wage or somewhere near that while they're inside, I don't really see a big problem with that. Is when they get out. You know, I can see it coming out. But we don't want to pay them like 50 cents an hour to take this training, especially as we said, it's not recognized in the state as a viable occupation. And that's what I said when I came out, you know, as a food, there's some curriculums they had here in Richmond where you had these official titles when you go through the training. When you look at the workforce, there's nothing there that says, well, you can come in as a such and such and make X amount of dollars. That's really not there. So I feel your pain on that one. I understand it, but we have to come up with a compensation model for that, and that's something that I talk with advocates across the nation about. Even for community members who get involved, there should be some type of compensation model for all those individuals. So yeah, let's think about a compensation model, and we need to come back to the table with that. Thank you for the question.
Yeah, it's a great question and a great follow-up idea as well, to have a compensation model and to look at different options about what has happened. So Shay, there's a question for you, follow-up from Laurel. I want to draw people's attention to Jennifer's request about incorporating ideas into the draft plans for the Middle James. So we have time for just one or two more responses. Shireen has put in a question as well. So Shay, I'll turn it over to you, and then Christopher and Shay for closing reflections. And then in our last few minutes, we'll share our evaluation, which is really helpful for planning. Can't tell you how helpful it is, and some of our next steps. So Shay? The question from Laurel, in case you haven't seen it, is can you clarify, are your programs only for folks actively incarcerated, or are they also for those recently released? And I didn't know if you wanted to add anything else based on Laurel's second question as well.
Yeah, I'll add to Laurel, just going off of Chris's comments. There's a few things. Yeah, I think exploitation is something you have to be really conscious of. And this program, you know, when we were talking to industry folks and getting feedback, that was one thing that was brought up is, can you have inmates go on to state lands and do, you know, invasive species management? And, you know, we can explore that, but that's not the purpose. The purpose is the educational and skill building. So all the programs we've been piloting, that's their primary intention. And then when we started doing the riparian forest buffer one is when we started going on to the CREP properties. And so that was certainly building capacity for Mifflin County to be able to, you know, manage those CREP buffers. However, production wasn't, you know, the primary intent. It was, they were out there learning, you know, what does spraying equipment look like? What are some of the tools we're using? Identifying some of the plant species. So we were able to go out there and do a lot of maintenance, but it wasn't about, okay, let's get this done today. So we're very conscious of that, like Chris mentioned. And as we've been doing the program, we set up a scholarship fund so that anyone who's interested, who participates in the program, once they get out, if they want to pursue a career in this and there's other trainings they want to take, you know, because a lot of our Penn State Extension has some really great trainings they offer to the public. So that scholarship fund is there to help them with that. Or if even, you know, it can be applied to other things too. We can talk about equipment. I mean, it's pretty open as far as what they can apply to use those scholarship funds for. Unfortunately, not a lot of people have tapped into those. We also, just really quickly, in 2020, we planned to do another riparian buffer vocational training at Huntington, and because of COVID, any external programs weren't allowed to come into Huntington and do that. So instead, we applied for an IFWIF grant and are hoping to kind of set up almost an apprenticeship model where the Alliance for the Chesapeake Bay would be a subcontractor, and they would hire re-entrants specifically who want to do this, you know, do this as a career path, the riparian forest buffer installation and maintenance. And it pays them, you know, more than, I think we agreed to, it was like $15 or $18 an hour. And it would be in addition to a full-time job. So, and we thought too, that might allow for more individualized training specific to, you know, what areas we would need to strengthen. So, and that kind of gets to the question we wanted to pose to y'all, was just what does success look like for these kind of programs? And that's something we've been talking about, because I know a lot of like correctional facilities and even leadership sometimes within our Department of Conservation and Natural Resource and our, you know, state administration, you know, want to see, okay, well, how many people got jobs in this industry? But that's not always, you know, I think I struggle with that. That's not always like the measure of success. Sometimes it's, you know, they're having conversations with their family and their communities about, you know, oh, this is an invasive, you know, plant, like this is knotweed, or just what does a monoculture look like? And so, and those are the conversations, you know, that's success too. So I think that was, if, you know, you have time, you can put that in the chat of like what, you know, success looks like to you all.
Right. So we're putting the, is that, you're talking about the Jamboard link, Shay, specifically about what success looks like, or?
Yes, and yes,
So,
and
yeah. Great. So we're going to introduce two things. We're wrapping up here now in the next few minutes. Jamboard is a Google part of the Google tool suite. It's a very simple, intuitive sticky note. If you go, we're not going to do it as a group right now, but it's something that would be helpful for the group to know what your feedback is. So there are two things we're going to ask you to give us your feedback on after we wrap up. If you go to the Jamboard, the fourth tool on the left looks like a little Post-it note. Grab it, drop it in center, type in your thoughts, and hit go, and they'll pop up. You can drag them around. It's a fun tool, and you can click on it directly from the link that's in the chat roll. Shireen has also asked, you know, put in a good idea about a pre-training questionnaire, and Chris has replied as well. So good thoughts there, Shireen and Chris. Any closing phrases, just phrases, Chris or Shay, as we get ready to wrap up today, and we're going to give people your contact information here as well. I'll turn it back to you just for very brief closing comments.
Okay. Well, thank you. I appreciate it. I had this thought about housing, because I know we talk about employment and housing is a big concern for folks returning citizens. And so how do we get there? Like you said, this vision of success. I just had one thing I think about during incarceration. They had things like halfway houses in a lot of states. With Virginia's abolishing parole, there was no need for a halfway house where people would actually go transition. So I'm thinking about that concept of housing. You know, if we can house folks, even build, I say a college for folks who want to go into conservation and work for and be a part of the conservation workforce. I think I shared in the chat that, you know, I was willing to go anywhere. There was a farm up in northern part of Virginia. I was willing to go live on the farm just to be more involved with that type of work. But they didn't have the facilities and they couldn't really house me. So that's one of the great options, I think. So looking at addressing that, and if you have something like that, and then possibly, as I said before, looking at supporting individuals. The individual I was talking about earlier, William Weber, he works with an organization called Communities at Work. It is in Richmond, and they said they plug into employers and large corporations and different employers to make sure that they support individuals coming out, whether it's counseling, financially, just whatever it takes to support that individual, not just relying on what they can produce. So it's like for most of us coming home, it's about the quality of life. So, you know, we're trying to improve our quality. But in doing that, we have to learn that. It's basically, I'm still learning. After being out 7 years, I'm still learning how to live, how to develop relationships. I'm a grandfather now, so I have grandchildren I'm with now. So the whole process, I guess, looking at holistically. So like I said, I think housing, I put it in the Jamboard, a vision of maybe how can we house those individuals coming out. And so awesome. The final thought is for me it's always been empowerment. We have to empower individuals in the right way. And if we want to cultivate a viable workforce with, and create a vision of success, we have to look at everything holistically. We can't look at just one part. We have to bring all these pieces together, and including those individuals and their families and our community members. They have to be a part of the conversation. So I think looking at it holistically and looking at all our stakeholders, everybody in the process need to be at the table. I know it's a huge challenge, but I think we can do it. Thank you.
Awesome, great. Thanks, Christopher, so much. Shay, closing words, closing phrase?
Just if anyone has ideas that, they think could improve or enhance the programs, please reach out. I'm always open to, to comments and whatnot, so.
Great. Well, let's thank Christopher and Shay. Snaps, claps, round of applause, all the things for such a great presentation. We appreciate your time so much. So thank you, both of you, really inspiring work. Emily has put a link to both the Jamboard and the evaluation in the chat roll. We actively went through all the evaluations from last year in planning this one, as well as did a survey. So I can't tell you how helpful your feedback is in planning future buffer summits and for guidance for the consortium as a whole. So if you can fill out the evaluation, we would greatly appreciate it. Other closing things, on our website, you'll see information about our next meeting, which is taking place on November 12th, jamesriverconsortium.org. We will be sharing a summary and slides from the summit today. The meeting on the 12th is going to be 10:45 a.m. to 12 p.m. And again, with a tour at the Brawford farm from 2:30 to 4:30 p.m. We'll be sharing the links again for the summit today with attendees and the registration list, and then separately the November 12th information's on the website. You can also join the email list if you're not on it yet from the website. I want to thank Emily and all her hard work getting us ready for the summit today. So let's thank Emily. Yay, thank you, Emily. And Amber, I'm going to turn it over to you to close us out today.
Oh, on the spot. I don't have any big statements, just that I think it was a great day. Thank you, both of you, for organizing stuff. And I know I learned a lot and have some things to think about. Thanks everybody for hanging in there with us. I know it was a long day, but it went quick. And yeah, I think we're going to be looking through some of these comments and things. We always try to do presentations and opportunities that build on what people are really interested in. So stay tuned. Hopefully we can keep these conversations going in some way.
Great. Thank you, Amber.
Yep.
So as we're wrapping up today, we're going to stay on the line for a few minutes. If anybody wants to stay on, if you would like to put one offer into the chat roll as we close out about one thing that you want to offer for your watershed work or for the consortium, to put your offer in the chat roll. One ask, if you have an ask for consortium members or watershed partners, offer that you're welcome to close it out in the chat roll as well. With that being said, thanks everyone for joining. Hope you have a wonderful rest of your day and a good fall. And feel free to put your offers and asks in the chat roll, and we'll stay on for just a little bit as well. Thanks everybody. Take care.